Hello, I'm Sarah Ferguson. Welcome to this budget special. Back in March, the Morrison government delivered its final budget as the nation emerged from years of pandemic lockdowns and an emergency response that left Australia saddled with record debt. Tonight, a new Treasurer delivers his first budget against a background of international economic turmoil, galloping inflation, rising interest rates and the threat of global recession. Jim Chalmers says he's looking forward to levelling with the Australian people about the challenges facing the economy. The chaos which followed the British government's ill-judged mini-budget provided a harsh lesson about what happens when you get it wrong. By contrast, Jim Chalmers is promising caution and restraint. We'll be back with more on what tonight's budget means for you, but first, here's the Treasurer.
I have received a message from His Excellency the Governor-General recommending, in accordance with Section 56 of the Constitution, an appropriation for the purposes of the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2022-2023. I call the Treasurer.
I present the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2022-23 and the explanatory memorandum.
I call the Clerk.
First reading, a bill for an Act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
I give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Speaker. I move that the bill be now read a second time. Speaker, from the Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands of Canberra to the Yuggera and Yugambeh lands of Logan and right around Australia, we acknowledge country and we commit to a voice for First Nations people. Yeah. Speaker, this is a responsible budget that is right for the times and readies us for the future. It delivers on the priorities of the Australian people and it repays their faith in a new government. Through a devastating pandemic, through a succession of dangerous and damaging natural disasters, through global uncertainty and painful price rises, Australians have demonstrated the best of our national character. Resolute and resilient in hard times, practical and pragmatic about the challenges we confront, optimistic and confident in a better future, and ready to work together to build it. In this same spirit, our Labor government's first budget does three things. It provides cost of living relief, which is responsible, not reckless, to make life easier for Australians without adding to inflation. It targets investments in a stronger, more resilient, more modern economy, and it begins the hard yards of budget repair. It recognises that our best defence against uncertainty around the world is responsible economic management here at home. Yeah. Speaker, we now confront the prospect of a third global downturn in a decade and a half. This time not a financial crisis or a pandemic, but a war driving high prices and higher interest rates here and around the world, and the risk of another global recession. And this time demands a different response, one that puts a premium on what's responsible, affordable and sustainable. That's why this budget pays for what's important, strengthens our buffers against adversity and begins to build a better future. It delivers on our commitments: cheaper childcare and more paid parental leave, better access to health care, cheaper medicines and a better standard of aged care, fee-free TAFE and more university places, cheaper and cleaner energy, more affordable housing and a future made in Australia. Speaker, this is a solid and sensible budget suited to the conditions. Australians know that this is a time of great challenge and change. The global economy teeters again on the edge, with a war that isn't ending, a global energy crisis that is escalating, inflationary pressures persisting and economies slowing, some of them already in reverse. All of this is now reflected in the updated forecast for global growth, downgraded since the March budget for this year, next year and the following year. Now, in this uncertain environment, we are pleased and proud that Australia has plenty going for us, including low unemployment and good prices for our exports. But while we intend to avoid the worst of the turbulence from overseas, we can't escape it completely. Global challenges, along with high inflation and higher interest rates, will have an impact. Our economy is expected to grow solidly this financial year by 3.25%, before slowing to 1.5% growth for 2023-24, a full percentage point lower than what was forecast in March. The hit to growth will have an effect on employment, but jobs will continue to be created and unemployment is expected to stay low by historical standards at 4.5% in 23-24 and 24-25. Inflation is expected to peak at 7.75% later this year, before moderating over time to 3.5% through 23-24 and returning to the Reserve Bank's target range in 24-25. Wages are growing faster now than they were before the election, but that welcome news is tempered by rising electricity prices and grocery bills eating into pay packets. When that inflation moderates, real wages are expected to start growing again in 2024. Speaker, as we were finalising this budget, floods were once again tragically taking lives, wrecking homes, shutting businesses, disrupting livelihoods and pushing up the cost of living. Once again, we are reminded of the solidarity that living on this harsh land demands of our people and of our communities. It speaks to a unique Australian way of responding to adversity, looking out for each other and looking after each other and lifting each other up. These are human tragedies first and foremost that come with broader consequences for the economy and for the budget. The government has acted quickly to make disaster assistance payments available. $3 billion has been provisioned as a response to recent floods. We will fund Disaster Relief Australia to help deploy more than 5,000 extra volunteers when future disasters strike. And this budget also invests up to $200 million a year in disaster prevention and resilience through the Disaster Ready Fund. In times like this, our government will always step up and do the right thing, standing with communities through the crisis and through the recovery. Speaker, Australians know that a complex combination of challenges at home and abroad is pushing up the cost of living. They know that governments can't make inflation disappear overnight. And they don't need us taking steps that would just make the problem worse by putting even more pressure on prices and making the independent Reserve Bank's job even harder. Instead, they need us to be responsible, reasonable and targeted, with policies that are affordable, fair and future-focused, delivering a long-term economic dividend. And that's what this budget does, with a 5-point plan for cost of living relief. Cheaper childcare, expanding paid parental leave, cheaper medicines, more affordable housing and getting wages moving again. This is a $7.5 billion package that helps put some money back in people's pockets, boosts productivity and grows the economy. But it's carefully targeted and carefully timed so that it avoids placing additional pressure on inflation. Speaker, from July next year, early childhood education and care will be more affordable for more than 1.2 million eligible Australian families who will benefit from higher subsidies. Yeah. Cheaper childcare is a game-changing investment in families, in our workforce and in our economy. It will increase the paid hours worked by women with young children by up to 1.4 million hours a week in the first year alone. Wow. That's the equivalent of 37,000 extra full-time workers. And because our early childhood educators guide our young ones and help them grow in these critical early years for the best possible start in life, it's much more than care. And it's also cost of living relief with an economic dividend. And that's what paid parental leave is as well. Tonight, our Labor government delivers the biggest expansion of paid parental leave since its creation. Yeah. This budget invests more than $530 million to progressively scale up the scheme, reaching 6 months paid leave in 2026. For two-parent families, a portion of this leave will be reserved for each parent to encourage families to share caring responsibilities. Again, this goes beyond taking a bit of pressure off household budgets. This is about greater equality and greater security for Australian women and more dads doing their bit. It's about participation and productivity, and that's what makes it economic reform as well. Speaker, this budget also makes medicines cheaper by slashing the PBS maximum general co-payment to $30 a script from the 1st of January next year, saving up to $12.50 per script for about 3.6 million Australians every year. And the budget does more to confront Australia's housing problem. Rents are through the roof and many families are struggling to keep up. Supply hasn't kept up with demand, which means too many struggle to live close to where they work. Too many are stuck on waiting lists for social housing. And for too many, the great Australian dream of home ownership seems completely out of reach. Our country can do better than that, and our government will. With the Housing Australia Future Fund building 30,000 new social and affordable homes in its first 5 years, and the National Housing Infrastructure Facility supporting an additional 5,500 new homes. With the Help to Buy scheme allowing up to 40,000 Australians to own their own home with a lower deposit and a smaller mortgage. With the regional first home buyer guarantee supporting another 10,000 new homeowners each year. And by helping more Australians downsize to a suitable home, which will free up housing stock for younger families. But tonight, Speaker, we go further and we do more. I am proud to announce that we have just struck a new national housing accord between governments, investors and industry to build the affordable homes that our country desperately needs and to help tackle our housing crisis. The ambition of this accord is big and it's bold. It's an aspiration to build 1 million new, well-located homes over 5 years from 2024. Most of this supply needs to come from the market, not the government, but there's a role for government, and we intend to play a leading role by coordinating and kickstarting the investment that we know needs to happen. To get the accord started, this budget commits an additional $350 million in funding for another 10,000 new affordable homes on top of our existing commitments. This will be delivered through an ongoing funding stream to help cover the gap between market rents and subsidised rents, making more projects commercially viable. State and territory governments will build on our commitment with up to 10,000 new homes as well. That's up to 20,000 new affordable homes in total. Along with local governments, they will tackle supply problems caused by land release and zoning policies. Institutional investors, including super funds, have endorsed the accord and will work with us to leverage more investment that delivers for their investors and members' interests and for the national interest as well. And peak organisations for the construction sector support building these homes at a high energy efficiency rating and training more apprentices under an extended skills guarantee. Now, we don't pretend that this accord solves every issue, nor do we pretend we can solve this problem completely overnight. But this is a serious start, a serious agenda that will lead to more Australians knowing the security of a good job and decent housing. Speaker, if there's one fact that sums up nearly a decade of wasted opportunities and warped priorities, it's that real wages are lower today than they were 10 years ago. It will take time to turn this around, but Australians now know this. Deliberately keeping wages low is no longer federal government policy. Our new government has already acted to get wages moving again. First, for the lowest paid Australians, supporting a pay rise for about 2.7 million workers on the minimum and award wages. The majority of them are women. Next, by supporting a wage increase for aged care workers. Again, mostly women. Next, by making it easier to implement our agenda for a stronger and more resilient economy by making it easier for parents to earn more with cheaper childcare, training more people for higher wage work, investing in the industries that create secure, well-paid jobs, and fixing the broken bargaining system. Because the hard truth, Speaker, is that our economy wasn't delivering like you needed it to, and it isn't as resilient as we need it to be for the challenges that we face together. Too much of our potential has been wasted, and the costs of that are clear, with falling real wages and flatlining productivity and widespread skills shortages, and too many Australians denied the opportunity of a better future. The Jobs and Skills Summit that we hosted with the Prime Minister was all about bringing people together to help reverse these trends, finding consensus on the challenges and common ground on the solutions. And we agreed there that full employment, productivity growth and equal opportunities for women should be core objectives of government policy. And we know the key to this is quality investments in the capacity of the Australian economy and the capabilities of the Australian people. So, Speaker, this budget builds a stronger economy, more resilient, more inclusive and more modern. And skills are absolutely central to this. In 2012, more than 57,000 Australians completed a trade apprenticeship. By 2021, that number had dropped by more than 20,000. So tonight we fund a better future for vocational education. Yeah. Together with the states and territories, we are making a $1 billion investment in fee-free TAFE and vocational education places, providing 180,000 places next year, the first stage in our plan for nearly 500,000 fee-free TAFE courses for Australians, learning skills for jobs in priority areas like the care sectors and the digital economy. This budget also invests more than $770 million for better schools, happier and healthier students and more qualified teachers. And we'll invest $485 million to create 20,000 new university places over the next 2 years for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Yeah. Because no Australian should be denied by poverty, by postcode or by lack of privilege their chance at a better future. Yeah. Speaker, nothing speaks more to that future or to a more modern economy than cleaner, cheaper, more reliable energy. After nearly 10 frustrating years and more than 20 failed energy policies, Australia now has a government that understands the generational and economic imperative of acting on climate change, and a plan that provides stability to the energy grid and stability to investors. Our plan drives investment in renewable energy, which is cheaper energy, and delivers thousands of new jobs in the coming years, many of them in our regions, by leveraging our existing traditional strengths and creating new ones as well. To help get us there, our government will establish a $20 billion fund for energy transmission. And we've already started by backing projects including investments connecting offshore wind farms in Victoria and Tasmania's Marinus Link project. And this budget begins to implement our Powering Australia plan with more than $800 million invested in cutting taxes on electric cars, building a national electric vehicle charging network and hydrogen refuelling stations on our highways, providing solar battery storage for up to 100,000 homes, and ensuring renters and apartment owners can benefit from cheaper energy as well. And Speaker, a better future for Australia must mean a future made in Australia. Yeah. No more sleepwalking while other advanced economies seize new opportunities. No more surrendering industries and jobs overseas. No more selling out our future by clinging to the past. Our $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund will help finance projects that expand our industrial base, diversify our economy, create sustainable, well-paid jobs and grow our regional centres. In clean energy manufacturing, in medical manufacturing, in new technologies, in agriculture and in critical minerals, so that we can be a country that makes things again, so that we can add more value to the things that we sell to the world, and so that every part of the country can have a stake in our Australian-made future. Speaker, this budget focuses on building what we need, protecting what's precious to us, and backing the people, sectors and communities strengthening our economy. It includes an investment pipeline of more than $120 billion in transport infrastructure over the next decade to get people and products moving faster, extending full fibre access to 1.5 million more homes and businesses, and improving mobile coverage in regional, remote and natural disaster-prone areas, supporting small business with new energy efficiency grants and extending tailored mental health and financial counselling programs. More funding and more staff to slash the visa backlog so employers can fill labour shortages. Protecting our farmers and primary producers by boosting our biosecurity defences. And safeguarding for future generations the unique and precious natural wonders of our continent, with $1.8 billion for environmental and heritage protection, including an extra $204 million to accelerate the defence and restoration of our Great Barrier Reef. Speaker, while our economic policies put a premium on resilience, our fiscal strategy puts a premium on restraint. Now, this is important. To keep spending under control, to give ourselves a better buffer for any further downturns, and to make sure that we're not adding to inflation. Now, this budget makes hard decisions for hard times. New policies have been largely offset across this year and next to avoid adding to inflation when price pressures are most acute. And nearly all of the tax upgrades over the forward estimates have been returned to the budget, not spent. 99% returned to the budget over the next 2 years, and 92% returned to the budget over the next 4 years. Now, as a result of this discipline, payments will fall in real terms over the next 2 years, and real spending growth over the forward estimates is flat, averaging just 0.3% a year. Speaker, Australians just don't have enough to show for $1 trillion of debt, and gross debt as a share of GDP at its highest level in more than 70 years. Now, our responsible decisions mean gross debt to GDP will be 37.3% in 22-23 and remain lower over the forward estimates compared to the pre-election forecasts. So that's less debt than our predecessors, less debt but with more to show for it. The deficit for 2022-23 is now forecast to be $36.9 billion, an improvement of $41.1 billion. But while the temporary revenue boosts we're getting from higher employment and higher commodity prices will fade and fall, the profound and permanent spending pressures on the budget are forecast to grow and grow. The budget that we inherited was stuck in a structural deficit. So our job in the short term is to limit growth in spending, especially while inflation is high, return as much of our revenue upgrades as we can to the bottom line, and focus new spending on investments that grow the capacity of the economy. And this budget does that. And in the longer term, there's a bigger job to do as well, to put the budget on a more sustainable path. But tonight we take the first step with a budget repair package that delivers $28.5 billion in improvements over the next 4 years. Now, this unwinds wasteful or unnecessary spending, redirects it towards higher quality investments and priorities, and improves the integrity and fairness of our tax system. Our spending audit has helped identify $22 billion in savings over the next 4 years. This includes our election commitment to reduce spending on external contractors, consultancies, advertising, travel and legal services, expecting to save the budget $3.6 billion. And this budget makes our tax system more sustainable by making sure multinationals pay a fairer share of tax in Australia, by extending successful tax compliance programs, and by giving the ATO the resources they need to crack down on tax dodging. Together, these initiatives save a further $4.7 billion over 4 years. Now, this is just the beginning of our budget repair work, and it's just the beginning of the conversation that we need to have as a country about our economic and fiscal challenges and about the choices that we need to make on what is affordable and what is fair, so we can pay to service the debt that was left to us, when borrowing costs are the fastest growing budget pressure, rising at more than 14% a year over a decade. And so we can pay for the things that Australians value most. Speaker, our priorities speak to who we are as a country, how we care for each other and how we protect each other. We choose to pay for better hospitals and healthcare. This budget invests $6.1 billion in hospitals, in Medicare, in extending COVID-19 support and expanding access to healthcare in the suburbs and regions of our great country. We choose to pay for better aged care and better wages for those giving care. This budget invests more than $2.5 billion to put nurses back into nursing homes, improve the quality of food and respond to the recommendations of the Royal Commission. We choose dignity for Australians with a disability. This budget begins the task of repairing the NDIS and securing its future. And we choose to defend our nation against current and future threats. Our government will ensure the Australian Defence Force is well positioned to meet our security challenges over the next decade and beyond, with defence funding rising beyond 2% of GDP over the forward estimates. And after nearly a decade of neglect and disrespect, we are restoring our role as a diligent and dependable partner and friend to our Pacific neighbours for a stable, peaceful and more prosperous region. Speaker, in this budget we're also funding a record investment of $1.7 billion over 6 years to end violence against women and children, investing $1.2 billion in practical measures to close the gap for First Nations people and communities and to begin preparations for a referendum on a voice to Parliament, allowing older Australians to keep more of their pension when they work, responding to the recommendations from the interim report of the Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicide, and investing in better support for the women and men who serve us, establishing the long overdue National Anti-Corruption Commission, and beginning a new discussion about measuring what matters, the strength of our economy and the well-being of our people. Speaker, Australians know that there are hard days to come and hard decisions to accompany them. And getting through this period stronger than we were before will rely on the very best aspects of our national character: our resilience, our pragmatism, our cooperation and our confidence, and above all else, our belief in each other. And it will rely on a government dedicated and determined to confront challenges ignored for too long and to seize the opportunities that won't wait for us any longer. This budget does more than end a wasted decade, a decade marked by energy chaos, a crisis in aged care, skills shortages and stagnant wages, and not enough to show for $1 trillion in debt. It does more than draw a line under the drift, decline and decay that defined it. It begins to put things right. It begins to build a better future that befits our people and the sacrifices that they make for each other. A future we can all have a stake in, all sharing in its success. A stronger, more resilient Australia with more opportunities for more people in more parts of our amazing country. I commend the budget and the bill to the House.
Hello again. That was Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivering Labor's first budget in almost a decade. You could call it a bank not spend budget, saving a multi-billion-dollar windfall delivered partly by soaring commodity prices as a buffer against tough times ahead. The Albanese government is betting its political fortunes that cheaper childcare and medicines, expanded parental leave and boosting pensions will be enough to ease the pinch for households as the cost of living continues to rise. Shortly, I'll interview the Treasurer live, but first here's National Affairs Editor James Glenday to run through the main elements of this budget.
For Jim Chalmers and Katie Gallagher, this is one of the biggest nights of their careers. The first economic blueprint of a first-term government will set the direction for the years to come. The nation's freshly redone books account for Labor's pre-election promises and highlight the need for budget repair.
There's a pretty big structural hole in the budget. Does there need to be a conversation about cutting spending or raising taxes?
Well, of course there needs to be a conversation about how we improve the budget position, but what we've done is we've made a really strong start here.
This financial year, the country is forecast to be $36.9 billion in the red. In the next, the deficit will rise to $44 billion, and by mid-2026, it's on track to be $49.6 billion. Things were expected to be much worse. The world's paying top dollar for our natural resources, and there are more people in work, which is helping boost tax intake. The Treasurer has decided to bank almost all that extra money, meaning compared with the March budget, net debt will be nearly $100 billion less in 4 years' time. But the cost of borrowing money is rising because of the increases in interest rates. By mid-2026, gross debt repayments will hit $31.9 billion, or more than the combined cost of higher education and the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Interest rates are of course climbing to try to stem increases in the cost of living. Inflation, one of the big stories of this budget, is forecast to peak at 7.75% by Christmas and 5.75% over the financial year, before dropping to 3.5% the next. That's due to events like damaging floods, which will push up food prices, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is driving up energy costs, and COVID lockdown measures in China, our biggest trading partner. For wage earners, it's bad news because inflation will continue to outstrip pay packets this year, with only modest increases forecast from 2024. Electricity prices are a big contributor to inflation. They'll be 20% higher by December and a further 30% higher in the next financial year.
I think any responsible government facing these kinds of price hikes for electricity and for gas needs to consider a broader suite of regulatory interventions than they might have considered in years gone by.
This budget does include a so-called cost of living relief package worth $7.5 billion to deliver on already announced promises to make childcare cheaper, expand paid parental leave, cut the costs of medicines and build more affordable housing. But the Treasurer says he can't splash more cash without risking making inflation much worse.
The defining characteristic of this budget is spending restraint. And that's because the primary influence on the budget is our inflation challenge.
Also a challenge, economic growth, which is forecast to be 3.25% this year, falling to just 1.5% in the next. And more people are expected to lose their jobs in the period ahead, with unemployment increasing from 3.75% to a still low 4.5%. As promised, the budget makes space for Labor's big renewable energy plans, including the $20 billion fund to upgrade transmission lines. There are also some modest savings. Over the next 4 years, $22 billion has been cut or redirected from the former government's projects. An extra $3.7 billion is expected to be raised from tax compliance and $952 million from more scrutiny of multinational tax returns. But one of the government's biggest challenges remains the rising annual costs of the age pension, medical benefits, defence, aged care and hospitals, while the NDIS and interest repayments are expected to experience double-digit increases, putting big pressure on the bottom line over the next decade.
We're being upfront with the Australian people about some of the challenges that lie ahead.
The government's finance team say it's committed to putting the budget on a more sustainable path, but concede there's a lot of work ahead.
James Glenday reporting. As the Treasurer makes his way to the studio, let's go to the ABC's political editor, Andrew Probyn, 7:30's chief political correspondent, Laura Tingle, and Q&A host, Stan Grant, for their analysis. Andrew, I'll start with you. There's a moment in a budget lock-up where you've been looking at the budget papers where the narrative emerges. What was it today?
Well, the narrative today, Sarah, is that there's one clear winner and millions of losers. The big winner is the federal purse, which is awash with billions of dollars in extra revenue. $150 billion extra revenue since the March budget. That's because of the war in Ukraine and high commodity prices. The losers, and there's lots of them, households, workers who now have to deal with the twin peril of a rising cost of living and the pay, which effectively goes backwards for at least 18 months or so. But there are two big messages out of the budget today. The first is on the sustainability of the NDIS, which at 14% is alarming the government and Treasury. That something has to be done to be dragging down that trajectory. And secondly, there is a big concern about electricity prices. Now, the budget is saying 56% over the next year and a bit, and with that intervention on regulation that the Treasurer is talking about. What's he talking about there? He's talking about somehow bringing down the cost of gas.
Now, Laura, there's also a barrier to clear on making and what makes a respectable budget. Did Chalmers clear that hurdle today?
I think he did, Sarah. Essentially, Labor treasurers are always a little bit paranoid about not sort of establishing their serious credentials as economic managers. So Jim Chalmers has set out to really do that. He's cleaned out the stables. They've put almost all of the money that was raised, that Andrew mentioned, in revenue onto the budget bottom line. Now, that's not just to establish Labor's sort of starting point economic credentials as managers. It's because they know they have to undertake a huge reform task in this term of Parliament, and hopefully if they win the next election in the next one. That means that they're going to have to cut spending quite savagely, really engage the public in a conversation about the sorts of things we need to spend money on and what it costs. They've dumped the cap on revenue. That's the limit that the Coalition has always had of how much tax there is as a proportion of the economy. But implicit in doing that, they're saying we're doing that because we're going to let tax rise or fall as the economy does, but we are going to put that to reducing the deficit. But the question then emerges, if you do that, how do you make the tax system fair so that people are paying what will inevitably be more tax across the economy? Because what this budget shows is that we just aren't raising enough tax to cover the cost of the services we now need for our aged, for our disabled and for our children.
Stan, I wanted to ask you about how you looked at this, given that the government campaigned on the idea that no one was going to be left behind. Now, looking at this budget today, who is getting left behind?
Well, Sarah, the Treasurer has just introduced himself in his first budget to the Australian people as someone who says to the poor and the heavily indebted, close your eyes, this is going to hurt. They're the people who are going to be left behind. And the dirty little secret, of course, is that those people, the poor, are always the ones who get left behind when it comes to fighting inflation. The government needs it to hurt them because that is how you get inflation down. And we know it's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt them in paying more for electricity, more for their food, to put fuel in the car. God forbid if you've got health emergencies and so on to deal with as well. And we're seeing this all around the world, aren't we? Look at the United Kingdom now, going into winter, where people are having to make a choice between whether they heat their homes or whether they eat. We've seen rising inequality in the United States, the impact that's having on their political system, and we've got trouble here with the wealth gap as well that is really becoming embedded in the country. 20% of the wealthiest in Australia hold 2/3 of the wealth of the country. So this is going to be an ongoing problem. I did notice today that there was some discussion in the press conference in the budget lockup about tax reform And going forward, that is going to be an area to look at. Will the government ultimately move on the stage 3 tax cuts, which will be a windfall to the rich? And when do we start talking about redistribution to pay back the people who are going to endure the pain of the next couple of years?
I just want to go back to Laura for a minute, because there was something else that was raised in the press conference, not in the budget papers we were looking at, but in the press conference, which was the Treasurer saying he might now consider some form of intervention in energy prices. What did you make of that coming out in that way at that time, Laura?
Well, I think the thing is the forecasts in the budget are really savage for energy prices, Sarah. They're talking about 20 and 30% increases over the next couple of years, after we've already had some really horrendous increases already. So the government has to say something about that, but I don't think they know exactly what they can do. I mean, they already are at a bit of a loss to talk about what they're going to do. There's triggers and and sticks and all sorts of mechanisms in place which nobody quite understands and which aren't really working. So I think, and there's also not sort of a unanimity of view, shall we say, within the government about what you can do. So I think he had to foreshadow that they're going to have to address this. But I think it does go to the point that Stan makes about equality, and that goes also to that question of tax reform. The government is going to have to, and will actually, I think, exploit, if you like, the fact that people are being hit so hard to make the case for tax reform, possibly going into the next election campaign, and issues like energy will be part of that.
Laura, thank you very much, and I can, of course, put those questions directly to the Treasurer now. You know, as a former political staffer, Jim Chalmers has already experienced plenty of budget lockups. I think this was number 16. But, of course, this is his first in the hot seat as Treasurer at a time when Australian households face rising rents and mortgages, as well as soaring grocery and power bills, while wages remain stagnant. He joins me now. But the first thing to say to you is congratulations on your first budget. We start there.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
Now, you've just said just a few moments ago that this budget is about hard decisions for hard times. Where are the hard decisions?
Well, there's $22 billion in savings, $28.5 billion in budget improvements. But I think most important of all, you know, we've had this really welcome, really substantial surge in revenue off the back of higher commodity prices. And what we've done is we've let that return to the budget, 99% of that over the next 2 years. That's the most responsible thing you can do when we've got high inflation.
But just look at that, those numbers. You spent $1 billion more than you saved this year. Over 4 years, it's $10 billion more than you've saved. So I repeat my question, where are the hard decisions?
Well, the hard decisions are in every dollar of those $22 billion in savings. The hard decisions is in every dollar not spent from this very temporary but substantial welcome improvement in tax revenues from some of these temporary conditions like higher commodity prices. Yeah. And when you sit around the Expenditure Review Committee table, as we have for many hours with my colleagues, one of the hardest things to do is to exercise spending restraint. I think what defines this budget and distinguishes it from our predecessors is restraint.
We'll come back to whether your colleagues, particularly outside of the government, think that those are indeed they add up to hard decisions, because I don't think they will agree with you. But you just mentioned the fact that you've got a revenue windfall this year, but you know that you can't rely on it being repeated. You've also got a very large structural deficit. Now, let's just explain that phrase to people who don't use that phrase every day. Basically, spending more than you earn. Is it inevitable that you'll either have to cut spending much harder or find new ways, new revenue to pay for all of this?
Well, I think we've made a good start on that tonight. You know, we've been really upfront with people for the entire duration of this government and before that as well, that we've got an issue in the budget. We've got big, persistent, structural spending pressures on the budget. That means we've inherited a budget in structural deficit. You need to start somewhere. When you've got $1 trillion in debt and deficits as far as the eye can see, you've got to start somewhere. And so we made some savings, more than in recent budgets. We exercised far more spending restraint than our predecessors. And we've already begun reforming the tax system, whether it's multinational taxes,
that's a very small
whether
amount
it's
of
tax
money.
compliance.
Excuse me, but it is less than $1 billion. So, you know, it's still money, but it's a very small amount of money compared with the task ahead.
Well, I think we've we've got about $6.5 billion worth of tax improvements in the budget. Net, we're investing a bit in that to get some back via compliance programs, but that's important too. Everything needs to make a contribution.
Sure.
When you're climbing a mountain of this height, you need to start somewhere, and that's what we did tonight.
Let's talk about the mountain. In fact, I was going to say the budget does face very steep increases in borrowing costs, pensions, social services, big increases in defence. We've already been hearing about it tonight. Hospitals, aged care, and an alarming blowout in the NDIS. How much is the NDIS expected to cost over the next 10 years?
Well, it's going to hit $50 billion before long, and it is one of the three biggest pressures on the budget. The biggest is actually interest costs on our borrowing.
Yes, it's important, but just stay with the NDIS because this was a big issue today. You just said it's going to hit 50 billion shortly, but I think the question is over the next 10 years, because we looked at the figures in the budget papers today. Tell me what you think it's going to cost, expected to cost over 10 years.
Well, it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And that investment, that investment is really important. Now, the reason why we've got, under Minister Shorten's leadership, we've got a review of the NDIS is because the spending trajectory right now is putting incredible pressure on the budget. Now, we want to make sure that people are at the centre of the NDIS. We want to do the right thing by Australians with a disability. That means making sure that spending in the program is sustainable. We hope that this review that is being undertaken right now means we can improve the quality of the spending over time, and then we'll update the figures.
Let's be clear, you just said hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
These are incredible figures, aren't they?
Yeah.
Now, you say there's a review underway. You don't always wait for reviews to be completed. You've also said recently that you're not going to fix it by cleaving millions of dollars out of it. You've just said a program that is going to cost, if it's left on its current trajectory, hundreds of billions of dollars. Australia cannot afford it. How much money do you think you're going to have to take out of the NDIS? You are going to have to cleave millions, aren't you?
Well, the point that I was making there is that we don't approach the NDIS as a source of savings for the sake of it. We believe in the NDIS. We created it. We think it's doing important work for Australians with a disability. We support it. We want it to endure and survive. And that means every dollar needs to get value for money. And that's what the review is about. Now, if it turns out the trajectory of spending is better than it is currently, then that's a good outcome as long as we're maintaining a level of service. And that's what the review is about. Now, what we've done tonight is we've started with some substantial budget repair. There is more to come, whether it's in this area or in other areas. We've already flagged that. The best way for your viewers to understand this budget tonight is that it is the first of 3 or 4 in the life of this parliamentary term. It is the beginning of a more responsible approach to the budget, not the end.
OK, let's talk about energy. There's nothing in the budget to help with people's energy bills. I want to know this. Why have you ruled out direct subsidies for families and businesses via rebates? I think it's something like the UK government is doing through its energy price guarantee. This during the worst period of the energy crisis. Why not? Well,
a couple of things about that. First of all, there are big investments in cleaner, cheaper, more reliable energy.
Those are long-term.
That's our agenda.
They will yield long-term.
Yeah, but that's our Powering Australia plan, and that's the objective of that plan. We also have cost of living relief in other areas, childcare, paid parental leave, medicines, housing, and getting wages moving again. So we do have an agenda for the cost of living. Now, we can only promise what we can afford to pay, and we think, obviously any government looking at those projected price increases in electricity, making up a bigger and bigger part of our inflation challenge. Any government that looks at that needs to consider a broader range of options. We've got a problem there, and I will work with my colleagues to consider whether there are regulatory or other steps that we can take to take some of the pressure out of this energy market. This pressure is coming from a busted energy market around the world, consequence of the war in Ukraine, but the consequences of that are being borne around the kitchen table, and we won't ignore that. Just on that, the question of regulatory intervention, I want to come back to the targeted rebates in a moment, but just on that question, why wasn't that in the budget? You've got a forecast for the increase in prices. It's pretty gobsmacking, 50%. This 50% over the next couple of years. That's a huge increase in prices, and it lines up with what the head of Alinta said the other day, that electricity prices could go to 35% next year. People can't afford it. If you think you need to intervene, why isn't it in your budget? Well, because these forecasts are relatively new to us. And the work that we need to do in this area is ongoing. And I think it's reasonable that we flag, as I did before today and as I did today, that whether it's gas, whether it's electricity, we've got a big problem. We've got an inflation problem. Biggest part of that, or the most concerning part of that, in addition to the impact of natural disasters, is what's happening in energy. That's happening right around the world, but we care about its impact on Australians. We've got more work to do, and I flagged that today.
OK, so what do you think it could look like? Do you actually know what to do to bring those prices under control?
Well, I'm not going to preempt any steps that we might take. You know, I need to work closely with relevant ministers and with the Cabinet, and more broadly as well, and consult, and with the state governments. I mean, remember that the regulation of a lot of the big parts of the energy market is the responsibility of states. So will you be convening
the state premiers to talk about this urgently?
Well, I'm sure it'll be part of our conversations that we have with counterparts, whether it's me with treasurers, the Prime Minister with premiers.
Sounds like something
Chris
more
Bowen
urgent is
colleagues.
required.
Well, we take it seriously. And, you know, I'm just being upfront with your viewers, as I was earlier today when I was presenting the budget. We know that this is a big issue. We're providing cost of living relief. We're trying to improve the energy market after a decade of denial and delay.
As of now, you don't know exactly how you're going to intervene, but let's move on to wages.
We'll have more to say about it.
Let's move on to wages, because at the same time, Australians are seeing their wages going backwards in real terms this year. You promised a Labor government would increase wages in real terms. When is that going to happen?
Well, on the budget forecast, 2024, but these are notoriously volatile, these wage forecasts. And what we've said about it is wages growth is picking up, but because inflation is so high, then the real wages situation is not as we would like it to be. Real wages were falling before the election. They've been falling after the election. There's two parts to that. The inflation problem, and the budget that we've handed down today has been primarily influenced by that inflation problem, but also getting wages moving again. The wages forecast in the budget that I handed down today showed wages growth faster than before the election,
yes, but
that's important.
But as you've just said, and I admire your honesty for saying it, those forecasts are not reliable, and we're in a very volatile international situation. We don't know what's going to happen in Russia. We don't know what's going to happen in China. So we don't know, actually, that crossover moment where you think wages are going to start rising is actually going to happen. And in fact, even if we look at those 4 years, I think we've got real wages growing by less than 1%. Isn't that just wage stagnation continuing?
No, wages growth is picking up. And it's picking up because we no longer have a government which treats wage stagnation as a deliberate design feature of their economic policy.
That's a line that we've heard from you before. I want to talk about what's in your budget today. Again, you promised that wages were going to move. You've conceded that we don't know what's going to be happening a couple of years out.
Well, wages are already moving. Wages are already moving.
By a very, very tiny amount.
But in the right direction. And in the right direction. We've had a decade of wage stagnation. Wages growth is picking up. We've been upfront with people and said when inflation is expected to head into the high sevens, then obviously wages are not going to keep up with that. Our job is to do what we can on the inflation side, do what we can on the wages side. We've got a wages policy, which is training people for higher wage opportunities, childcare so parents can work more and earn more if they want to.
Those things aren't going to bring wages up to the degree that you promised.
And reforming enterprise bargaining.
So are people going to mark this down as a broken promise?
Well, I don't think that they should, and it's up to people how they judge it. And I listen respectfully to the community, as you know. We care deeply about what people think about this budget. Of course we do. But more important to us is to get the economic settings right. I'm really confident that we've lined up nicely the spending restraint side of the budget, the cost of living relief, but just as importantly, the investment in a stronger economy, because this budget is more than battening down the hatches. It's about backing in families, it's about building a better future, and I think we struck the right balance.
Although, as we agree, it's families and households who are really struggling under the current conditions. I just want to look at one other Labor promise, which was leaving the Morrison government's tax cuts in place. And the reason I want to ask this is, why shouldn't Australians get some relief from the very large impact of bracket creep that is pushing people into higher tax brackets? Don't people deserve a break from that bracket creep?
Yes.
So they stay in place, no question.
Well, we've said repeatedly that there's a role for tax relief in our economy. And those tax cuts that you're referring to kick in at $45,000 a year, and that's important to us.
So that's absolutely no tinkering with that.
We've said it's important that people get some tax relief when the budget can afford it. Those tax cuts are legislated and we haven't changed our plans.
OK. I just want to talk about one other potential source of new revenue, which is which would, to improve the existing I always get this wrong, the PRT, the Petroleum Resources Rent Tax. So to be clear, it would be a way of getting more money from gas exporters, some gas exporters. Treasury is reviewing that system. Are you going to urge them that there is a compelling case to move much more quickly on that?
Well, let's see what they say. I mean, they began a process under the life of the former government. I actually pay tribute to my predecessor for starting the thinking on this, and they've got some of that work to finish. It was paused because of COVID, and they will finish that work at some point. And as always, I will listen respectfully to their advice. In the interim, my priority in the gas market, which is absolutely smashing our local industry, especially our manufacturers, Madeleine King did a good job getting more supply. Now we need to focus on the code of conduct and on prices, and that's the work that I'm doing right now.
Does that mean that you're going to end up more in Ed Husick's camp, which is that those gas companies are, I think he called them traitors and greedy?
I don't see it the way that people see it, that there's this dramatically different view in our cabinet. We want to support local industry. We want to keep faith with our international partners and our export partners in particular. We need to strike the right balance here, but the energy market is not working right now for local industry or for Australians. Any responsible government looks at steps it could take to change that.
We talked earlier about the multinational tax changes, and I think we agreed. In the budget papers, it's clear they net just they under $1 billion. Essentially, you're taking baby steps on tax reform in this budget, if I can put it like that. Will urgent tax reform be a priority in your next budget?
Well, we've just handed down this one tonight, and the work on the next one doesn't begin till tomorrow morning.
But presumably you've got that in your mind because this is just a first step budget.
Look, we have taken some important steps, I think, on multinational tax reform, but also tax compliance and a couple of other in a couple of other ways. But that's important. That's a start.
The question is, are you committed to tax reform? Are you looking for a summit or reform in tax? I
think we should always be open to opportunities to make the budget more sustainable. But tax isn't the only way you can do that.
No, but are you interested in tax reform?
I'm interested in hearing all of the ideas from every corner of the community about how we can make our budget more sustainable. Tax is a part of that, but not the only part of it.
Still a little scar tissue left from when you were last, the Labor Party was last in government, but that's all we've got time for. Congratulations again on your first budget. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me back, Sarah.
Insiders host David Speers is standing by. David, what did you make of the Treasurer's responses tonight?
Well, Sarah, just to pick up on a couple of points you were discussing there with Treasurer Jim Chalmers, he wants to start a conversation. He said this a few times about the pressures that are there and building on this budget. And just now in your interview, he's dropped quite the conversation starter on the table, and that is in relation to the NDIS. Now, we already knew heading into tonight's budget that it was forecast to hit about $50 billion a year over the next 4 years. But what the budget papers indicate and what the Treasurer has just told you suggests that that is just the beginning. His line to you there that we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. It's a little unclear whether he's talking a cumulative number there over, the growth that we're looking at over the next decade, or whether he's looking well beyond the decade at what this could cost. But, from our look at the budget papers today, at the end of this decade, so by 2032, it would be getting close to that $100 billion a year figure. Now, that is clearly unsustainable. What is unclear is what the government's going to do about that. The coalition in government tried to rein it in by introducing some independent assessments. Labor fought against that. The coalition backed off. So what will Labor do here? There's an independent review underway. We'll see. The other one is the electricity and gas price problem. I don't want to use the word crisis lightly here, but we're talking about some very steep rises this year and next year laid out in this budget. But again, it is unclear what the government is going to do. It gets it. It needs to do something. The Treasurer is clear about that. But what regulatory change it's willing to do here? We know the options that are there. It's less clear what they're willing to do. Let's get some further analysis on tonight's budget with Daniel Wood from the Grattan Institute and Chris Richardson, independent economist, joining me here. Thanks very much for your time tonight. Daniel, let me start with you. Look, we heard from the Treasurer there and in his budget speech over and over again, this is a responsible budget. When you look at the economic outlook, the forecasts for the global economy and our economy, is this a responsible budget?
Look, I think it is relatively responsible, and I think it clearly has been tailored to the economic and fiscal circumstances that we find ourselves in. Frankly, there was some pretty good news in the short term in terms of the revenue position in particular, big windfalls. which yields about sort of 50 billion over the 4 years in terms of the parameter improvements. About 10 billion of that going out the door in terms of policy. So the government's very keen to point out that is more restrained than previous budgets, which is true, and frankly it had to be. As you say, we've got a real challenge with inflation, so we needed government to take a step back in terms of spending. We've got a massive problem with the medium-term budget position, which was set out very clearly tonight. So we actually really needed that sort of level of responsibility.
Well, Chris, I mean, the Treasurer in the warm-up to tonight's budget for weeks has been talking about these spending pressures, has been listing them over and over again. When you see them tonight, what do you think the government should be most worried about?
That set of numbers around the NDIS are huge. Need to understand, government actuaries are looking at this. They looked at it 6 months ago. They're looking at it now. In 6 months alone, they have added multi-billion dollars to the task. The federal component of NDIS spending set to go up 3.5 times in a decade. As you said, that's not sustainable. We have to do something about it. We already knew that there was an ongoing hole in the federal budget. The problem is, if you had to have any government's nightmare budget repair task, it's one that pits the rights and needs of Australia's disabled against the rights and needs of Australia's taxpayers, both of whom have reason to be grumpy about where things are headed.
Let's give us a dose of reality from the two of you on the spending restraint that is in this budget. We heard the Treasurer there talk about, I think it's more than $28 billion that they've saved or raised in various cuts or reprioritisations or new revenue streams. Danielle, is the government actually being fiscally careful here and saving much money?
I think it's certainly a positive to see some savings in the budget, and again, we haven't seen that for a little while. I think they've been clever about how they've gone about focusing on sort of low-value infrastructure. They've picked off some of the pretty heavily pork-barrelled grants programs of the previous government. But in a way, that's the low-hanging fruit. The big spending challenge, we've talked about the NDIS, but we also see hospital spending growing at 6%. We're seeing aged care spending growing at about that as well. There are a number of spending lines where big increases are forecast. Frankly, you actually, don't contain spending in the long term unless you do something about those big spending areas.
So fair to say they've found some savings, but the structural savings are really something to be debated next year.
They are going to have to move on structural savings. They're probably also going to have to move on structural revenue.
Well, let's talk about that, Chris. Structural revenue comes to this idea of tax reform. We heard Jim Chalmers talking to Sarah there, a little cautious about even wanting to say that he's up for tax reform, but he's up for the conversation. Where does that conversation need to begin?
Well, it starts at the other pressure point in the budget and in the economy, gas. Gas is central to, so why is inflation worse than expected? Why does that mean interest rates are going to stay higher for longer? Why is the government seeing a big slowdown that adds 150,000 people to the ranks of the unemployed in Australia? What is happening to gas prices? Up 20% in a couple of months, another 30% atop that next year. This is major damage to the Australian economy. It's unforced error. The main answers to that, sure, we can and we should absolutely tax gas better, but the government, Treasury tonight, has basically said the government's first attempt at that fixing the domestic gas trigger a complete fail. It needs a redo and it needs it fast. So yes, let's tax gas better. Let's have another look at stage 3. The problem isn't that it's desperately unfair. The problem is that it's too big, and let's restrain spending.
And when you say tax gas better, you are saying tax gas more?
Absolutely. Okay. We have an existing windfall tax. It raises nothing, is what I would say.
Do you both agree gas needs to be taxed more, and stage 3 tax cuts need to be trimmed? Danielle?
Yes, I think Chris is exactly right. The existing tax regime for gas has been totally ineffective. It needs to be redesigned, particularly at the moment when the windfall profits are massive. And yes, I think stage 3 needs to be cut back, not eliminated altogether, because bracket creep is a real phenomenon, but there are things you can do which cut the tax cuts at the top end, while still delivering kind of low and middle income earners, tax cuts, and substantially reduce the fiscal cost of the package.
Final one, the spending that is in the budget, we knew about most of it. The government's arguing it is a productive spend. It's not going to push up inflation. Just very quickly, Chris, is that right?
Not really. Look, they delivered their election promises and things like the paid parental leave changes. By and large, there's some good policy there. There's some popular policy there. There's not big policy. And no, they haven't started savings yet. You look at the bottom line, it's their decisions made it $1 billion worse this year, $10 billion worse across 4 years. We all know the big task still lies ahead.
We'll bring you back for the next budget, not too far away, but thank you for your analysis tonight, Chris Richardson and Daniel Wood. Appreciate that. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you, David. Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor will be leading the opposition's critique of tonight's budget, and he joins me now. Angus Taylor, welcome. One of the things that the Treasurer said today, you were in the lockup, but I think you didn't see his press conference. He said he's open to the idea of intervening on gas prices. Would you support that, given how high they are?
Well, the starting point is that what we've seen in the budget is Labor saying that electricity prices are going to go up by 50% in the next several years and gas prices going up by 40%. That's a major breach of an election commitment. They promised that they would go down by $275.
Circumstances outside of their control.
Well, yeah, election commitments are election commitments, though, Sarah, as you know.
Outside circumstances are also real. The war in Ukraine is real. Well,
they had an opportunity. The war in Ukraine happened before the election, and they could have changed their policy, and they didn't. So it was their policy going into the election, and they've broken that commitment. Now that they've broken it, they've got to try and fix the situation, and we'll look for ways to support them. The fastest way to get the gas price down is to get more supply into the domestic network. That's always been true. We saw that work ourselves.
So I don't think we should be having an argument about gas supply because, of course, there's plenty of gas in Australia. It's just that most of it goes overseas. But let's talk about what he's proposing. And you've just said you're open to supporting it. You would be open to some kind of mechanism to drive down prices in Australia, something like the gas reserve policy in WA, for example.
Well, look, Sarah, we haven't seen any proposal, and I'm not going to speculate or comment on
But on principle, you're open to the idea of something that handles directly, is targeted at these gas prices.
Well, my starting point is to get more gas into the domestic network. That's the key. And we've seen when that happens, whichever country it's in, whether it's in the United States or here, in both cases, we've seen the domestic price move away from the international price. We've seen that when we were governing, and it works. Now, that's always going to be our starting point. Now, if Labor has a different proposal, we'll consider it, but we haven't seen any proposals, so we're speculating at this point.
One of the other big things to come out today was the prospective increases in the NDIS. I don't know how closely you looked at those when you were in the budget lockup on your side. Would the NDIS have been targeted by a Liberal Party razor gang were you still in power?
Well, look, again, we're speculating. We're not in government. The Labor Party obviously is in government. I think, though, our starting point with this budget is that the real test for it is whether Labor was going to deal with the cost of living pressures Australians are facing, and they didn't. And it's very clear. If you're a typical Australian household, you're not going to see any improvement of your situation between now and Christmas. In fact, a typical family.
All right, I did just ask you about the NDIS. We can come back to it in a minute. Stay where you are for the moment. Okay. Would you support targeted rebates to households on price?
Look, what we want to see is Labor keep their election commitments. They committed not only a reduction of $275 in electricity prices, they committed also to relieve cost of living pressures on Australians. They committed to improvement in real wages, and yet we look at this budget and it's delivering none of that. Now, there are many different ways you can try to deliver those things. I think there's some ways better than others, but it doesn't matter. They were election commitments, and they're not being kept in this document.
Let's come back
to that's the disappointment, I think, for me, and I'm sure it's a disappointment for many Australians.
Let's just come back to the NDIS because the numbers are extraordinary. I think Jim Chalmers just mentioned future costs in the realm of hundreds of billions of dollars was the figure that he used. What should be done about the NDIS? It's a program that has bipartisan support. What do you think should be done to bring those costs under control?
Well, it is an important program, and we had to deal with the spending pressures when we were in government. They were growing fast, and you need to, in a budget, look at them as part of a broader aggregate of spending and make sure that your spending is growing more slowly than your overall economy. Now, better to have the economy growing fast And that way you can manage your spending in a sensible way at a level lower than your economic growth, and you can improve your budget situation.
But are you concerned?
NDIS is one of many issues.
It looks like it's the biggest. So are you concerned about the quantum, about the idea that it could grow by hundreds of billions, or let's say we counted 100 billion we could see over the forward estimates? What should be done?
Well, it needs to be sustainable. There's no question about that, and we'll work with Labor on ensuring that it is sustainable. I mean, I think that's something where there is real potential for both sides of politics to work together.
We're doing very well. We've got bipartisan support on fixing the gas prices and on the NDIS. These are magic times that we live in. I just want to talk to you about the regional grant funds. Looks like a lot of money has been diverted from those regional and grant funds. Is this going to be your biggest opening for an attack on Labor's budget?
Well, I think the biggest opening for the attack is that they're breaking a whole series of election promises, as I said, on real wages, on cost of living, on electricity prices.
How many months are we into the new government?
Well, they're election commitments, though, Sarah.
But they're not obliged to have arrived at them by this point, are they? I asked the question, but they're not obliged to be there now.
It's a good question. The problem is, no, of course they're not. The problem is that the budget lays out a plan where they don't meet those election commitments.
There is a slight growth according to the budget figures.
Across this election cycle, real wages will be going backwards. Cost of living pressures are intensifying. Electricity prices are going up
in those wages, just to be accurate on the figures as presented in the budget in 2024.
Across the election cycle, they'll have gone backwards. That's what's in the numbers.
Across the forward estimates, a slight increase, very small.
We can guess about when the election's going to be, but they are going backwards. But look, so coming back to your original question,
please,
which was remind me.
Yeah. So on regional grant funds,
regional grant funds.
Is this an opening for your? Is this going to be your principal political attack on Labor?
Yeah, look, it is an important political attack. Now, what we see in the budget is over $6 billion of infrastructure investment that is being deferred out beyond the forwards, and we don't know when it's going to be spent. That's $6 billion lost. Much of that is in regional areas, not all of it. A lot of it's in outer suburban areas. You know, in Western Sydney, for instance, there's a great deal of that sort of spending. That has disappeared, over $6 billion. We don't know exactly which projects have been lost, but we do know that's a very significant part of the infrastructure pipeline to lose, and there will be many important projects that regional areas, suburban areas are relying on for their future, for their aspirations, for the opportunities they're pursuing, that will be lost as part of it. We know, for instance, the Building Better Regions Fund has gone, and I've had councils contacting me today about projects that they were pursuing in that fund that they'd applied for, they'd put an enormous amount of effort into, gone. So it is true these are being lost, and I think being lost with it is great potential in regional and suburban Australia, right across the board. I mean, so it is a real concern to us. We will be looking very closely at which projects are lost, and we will be backing in and fighting hard for those projects that really count.
Angus Taylor, thank you very much, and I'm still going to repeat the fact that we've got 2 points of bipartisan agreement. Well done. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Sarah.
With tonight's budget, the Albanese government has again pledged to raise wages, but they won't be keeping up with inflation for a while yet. Here's David Speers.
Sarah, thank you. And to look at what this budget means for both workers and employers, I'm joined by Michelle O'Neill, the President of the ACTU, and Jennifer Westacott, the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Let's start with your big picture take on the budget. Jennifer, has the government got it right?
Look, I think this is a responsible, careful budget. I think it's kind of reset the fiscal position, it's stabilised the budget position. There's some good things in there for growth, massive skills package, women's participation, which is a big economic uplift, huge infrastructure spend, National Reconstruction Fund of $15 billion to start driving those new industries, some very carefully thought through reining in of spending, and the government's delivered on its election commitments, and that's important to build trust. But make no mistake, the hard yards are to come. You know, we've got $1 trillion of debt. The interest bill is the fastest growing payment in the budget beyond NDIS, beyond health. We've got unemployment set to rise. We've got feeble economic growth at 1.5%, growing to 2%. That's not the recipe for higher wages, not the recipe for higher living standards. We have got to get serious about reform, and we've got to sort of stop kicking these big, hard decisions down the road.
Michelle?
Look, it starts a really important work of cost of living relief for working people, but it also shows the urgent need for wage growth, and that's the missing part of the puzzle, David. We really welcome things like the improvements in accessible and affordable childcare, doing something about paid parental leave. These are so critical to ensuring that women can participate at work, but also the improvements in dealing with the housing crisis. Like, we have to address both affordability in terms of home ownership, but also rental. The other things that are important there are those investment in skills, the free TAFE places, getting TAFE re-energised and revitalised after a decade of neglect, and the improvements and commitment through things like the Reconstruction Fund and Rewiring the Nation to getting jobs moving in the renewable energy industry and in our regions.
But the measures to help don't kick in for some time. The childcare not until mid next year, the paid parental leave, well, not until 2026 that you'll get to the 26 weeks, and the housing not until 2024. In the meantime, you've got real wages still going backwards. Are you disappointed there's not more direct help in the meantime, or do you accept that it's just too hard?
No, it's not too hard, and which is why we welcome the fact that the government's committed this week to introducing the missing part of the puzzle, which is the new industrial relations laws. We need wages to start growing. It's good for workers, good for the economy, but the bargaining system's broken. Only 1 in 7 workers covered by bargaining. We need to make sure that we get it moving. It was a commitment from this government when they went to the election. The budget can't deliver all of that. We need the structural changes and allow workers and employers to get together, bargain properly, make it simple and fair and accessible, but deliver wage growth. If we don't have wage growth, we're not going to see that consumer confidence that the economy needs.
Now, I need to point out we haven't seen these industrial relations changes. They'll be introduced to Parliament later this week. They are, however, factored into this budget. And Jennifer, the budget doesn't suggest there's going to be a wages breakout, even with these IR changes. Does that give you some comfort around your concerns on these changes?
Look, I think, you know, we could have a longer discussion about the industrial relations reforms. We haven't seen the legislation. Look, I agree with Michelle. We want wages to grow. We want bargaining to increase. But we don't want a system that increases complexity, you know, increases strike action. The community doesn't want that. But make no mistake, if we are serious about wage growth, we'll get serious about doing something about that feeble 1.5% GDP growth. We'll get serious about that just still having a 2 in front of it in the forward estimates. We'll get serious about continuing the work on the skill stuff that Michelle's talked about. I totally agree with Michelle. We'll get serious about housing affordability and housing supply. We'll get serious about diversifying our industries. You can't do wages growth if the economy is just rolling along the bottom, and we need a combination. The IR system can't do the heavy lifting, the budget can't do all the hard work. It's a combination of all of those things.
One of the big problems, pressures on inflation and everything else, is electricity and gas, and we see tonight just how much that's going up, more than 50% for electricity, more than 40% for gas. This is a big issue for households. It's a big issue for a lot of business as well. Jennifer, the government's talking about what it can do, thinking about what it can do. What should it do?
Look, I think the first thing it has to do is stay the course on the climate change policies that they've put in place, because the net zero, the safeguard mechanism, the offsetting arrangements, because what's happened, well, why are we in this position? Because we've had years of policy uncertainty, which has turned off investment. We've had lack of coordination across the states.
But in the short term?
Well, then we've got to sort out the capacity mechanism, and that's crucial to make sure that we've got firming in the system. We've got to be careful that we keep a dual system going. We don't take things away before we've replaced them, because that's going to create price spikes. Look, clearly we're going to have to do something about hardship. We're going to have to make sure that we look after the people most vulnerable in the community.
Directly help them with their bills?
Well, I think we've got to, you know, what I want to see is a kind of conversation with the industry about what's the best way of doing that. I mean, that's been done in the past, but of course you've got to source revenue for that. The one thing that would be very unwise is to start thinking about a series of ad hoc taxes to kind of deal with that problem, because the very companies that have to make the decarbonised investment, you know, we don't want to start doing things that are going to make it worse.
So what's essential is that we get into the room, the gas producers, the manufacturers and the unions in this sector.
Yep, I agree.
We need to have them together saying there more needs to be done, and we can't wait for this. This is urgent. It's hurting working people in terms of trying to pay their bills, but it's also hurting manufacturers and putting pressure on jobs. It's critical that more is done in this. It was a good start in terms of some of the announcements tonight around the ACCC, but we have to make sure that we are both getting the gas reserve we need here in Australia, but also dealing with the price issue and stop dealing with it in an ad hoc way. I'd also say I think, you know, there's some pretty big profits being made by large companies in this sector, and we have to think about that in terms of what's going to happen going forward in the budget too.
Michelle O'Neill, Jennifer Westacott, thank you both.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, David.
Sarah, back to you.
Thanks, David. So how are voters reacting to tonight's budget? Jeremy Fernandez is in the outer eastern Melbourne suburb of Pakenham.
Sarah, it's places like this in the outer suburbs of our big cities that are really feeling the pinch from all those pressure points coming from cost of living pressures, cost of doing business, climate change. So let's gauge some of the reactions of people who've been watching the Treasurer this evening and seeing what they have to say. I'd like to introduce you to Margaret Simmons. Margaret, I thought of you when the Treasurer spoke about housing affordability and improving access to affordable housing, because I know you live in a caravan. What did you think of that announcement?
It was interesting because there's promise of more housing, but when that might be, how that affects me.
It'll take some time, won't it, to get there?
Definitely.
So you're not looking at moving into a house, being able to move into a home anytime soon?
No, most definitely not.
What are your aspirations? What would you like to do?
As in, I would like to have a house or a unit to live in, rather than in a caravan.
Yeah. That caravan is on a friend's property. At the same time, you're dealing with your job seeker payments being stretched because of the cost of living pressures. How are you finding that?
Extremely difficult. I cannot afford to rent a property at the moment.
What about your day-to-day costs, things like groceries, regular bills?
I get by because I have savings.
So you're drawing down on your savings?
I shouldn't actually say savings, it's superannuation. Right. So I've taken out early superannuation.
And just quickly tell me about what it's like looking for a job at your age. I know you found it very difficult. What's that been like for you?
Extremely difficult.
Why is that?
I just don't even seem to get as far as an interview. I do believe it's because I'm older.
Let me introduce you now to Chelsea. Chelsea, you used to operate a business as a myotherapist. You had to close down during the pandemic. What's that been like for you, recovering from that period?
It was really tricky. It was really hard mentally coming out of the pandemic. I just didn't have the work there anymore and spent quite a few months in a pretty bad place until I was offered a new job within the disability sector. But yeah, it's, you know, your whole last sort of 4 to 8 years worth of studying and going to school just gone.
Do you feel like this budget does things to look after you, those immediate pressures that you're facing?
Not particularly, no. Yes, I've got a new job. Yes, I'm getting paid now. I love what I'm doing, but I'm probably one of those people that, when I was younger, didn't look too much towards the future and feel like I've left my run a little late to buy a house now, which I think years ago wouldn't have been a problem.
Samantha, you work in aged and disability care. There was a fair bit in the budget for your sector. How did that make you feel?
Yep, home and community, that's my area, and that includes disability and aged support in homes. But yeah, I'm very pleased. I feel like it was a hopeful budget. We all knew that it was going to be a bit tight, you know, but I feel like it was a budget that had a lot of heart, and that Australians, me included, would want to support the more vulnerable in the community, and I feel like this budget perhaps looks a bit more at that.
Samantha, Chelsea, Margaret, thank you all so much for talking to us. Sarah, back to you.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, the government will need the support of the Greens and crossbenchers in the Senate to make tonight's budget pledges a reality. I'm pleased to say I'm joined now by Senators Jackie Lambie and David Pocock, as well as Greens leader Adam Bandt. Welcome to you all. Jackie, I'm going to start with you because I always like to start with you. But seriously, people in your electorate are going to suffer from these very, very high energy prices. We got new numbers tonight of increases up to 50% over the next couple of years. These are just extraordinary numbers. Should the government be providing targeted relief?
I have no doubt that the government should be doing something about targeted relief. I certainly believe the state government in Tasmania could do more too, since we own the hydro ourselves, and whether that means we should be part of the national energy market is in debate itself. But I can tell you now that most Tasmanians down there cannot afford for anything else to go through the roof. We've seen the floods and that have been going on recently. That's going to put a pressure on the cost of living down there. Fuel's through the roof. People are really, really struggling out there. I have noticed this is not given. I do not believe it has given the relief to those people sitting on or below that. Below those people that are doing it really tough there. I don't think this delivers a lot of relief to them, to be honest with you.
And you want to see direct relief on energy prices?
I absolutely want to see direct relief on energy prices. How they're going to do that is beyond me. I'd start with the gas companies starting to deliver a lot more. That's what I would be doing.
All right, let me go to you, Adam Bandt, on that, because in the press conference today, the Treasurer did raise the possibility for the first time that the government would be prepared to intervene in the market. Would you be encouraging them to do that?
Well, gas is now unaffordable for many homes and businesses, and even if they intervene now, the price will be out of reach for too many. It's going to stay high. What the government needs to do is give money to households and businesses to get off gas, because the prices are going to stay high. And one of the places
when you say give money, yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, one of the places they could start is by making these companies pay tax in the budget. Even though we're in the middle of a gas boom with prices sky high hurting people, there's going to be $450 million less collected in the government's gas tax. All right, we've got a broken gas tax. These gas corporations don't pay tax. Make them pay tax. Use that money to give households and businesses relief in the form of subsidies to get off gas.
Now, are you concerned about the inflationary impact of subsidies right now?
Well, the government is spending $250 billion in this budget on the stage 3 tax cuts, right? That's Clive Palmer and politicians get $9,000 a year out of
and
this.
Ordinary Australians get some relief from bracket creep, but do go on.
Very, very little. I reckon most people aren't going to get $9,000. I know that for a fact. That money could go on things like getting dental into Medicare, making childcare free, lifting income support for people who are really doing it tough. That kind of government-funded cost of living relief is not inflationary. But it builds in, it helps people deal with the everyday costs of things like going to the dentist, and they've squibbed that because instead they've chosen to delay cost of living relief for people, push some of the stuff that's out there out for years before it commences, while locking in $9,000 a year tax cuts for billionaires.
But right now, do you support the government's idea of intervening in the gas market, to be clear?
We need more intervention, and we need to make them pay tax, but it needs to be as part of a transition plan, because if the intervention is only about keeping people on gas when prices are going through the roof, that just prolongs the pain for people.
David Pocock, I want to turn to you because there was a kind of gasp that went around the room in the budget lock-up where I was when we realised the cost now, the rising costs of the NDIS. We assess them to be somewhere like $100 billion in the future. The Treasurer has just said hundreds of billions of dollars. What do you think should be done, and how concerned are you about the escalating costs of the NDIS?
What we saw in the budget was no surprises. And I think kicking a lot of these problems down the road to be dealt with in years to come. And a big one is around revenue. If Australians want things like the NDIS funded and want to look after Australians who need that support, how are we going to fund that? That's a hard conversation to have. Certainly when it comes to the NDIS, that's another conversation. I know Minister Shorten is looking at ways to make it more efficient, but it's a really hard thing. It is going up in costs at the same time that Australians are doing it tough. We've got 3 million Australians living below the poverty line.
And on that possible intervention with gas prices. Do you also support, are you with Adam Bant there, that you would like to see the government intervening now in the gas market rather than targeted rebates, which I think is what Jackie wanted?
Well, I'm really in favour of things like Commonwealth rent assistance. One of the groups of people that got totally missed in this whole budget were people on JobSeeker or people in private rentals. And so I think that is a targeted way. But clearly when it comes to gas, we're not capturing much of the value. Those resources belong to Australians. That is our gas that's being exported. We're paying export prices at the same time that the gas companies are going to be making $26 to $40 billion of extra profit this year. We'll potentially only get $1 billion of that. It doesn't make sense. You look what the Norwegians have been doing for a long time. That is our shared prosperity, and we should actually reap the benefits.
At the same time, there is a model for what Jackie is asking for, which is direct rebates. I think that's what the British government is doing. Would you be open to that idea?
I'd certainly be open to ideas that actually help with the cost of living crisis being felt across the country. And we haven't seen a lot of courage in this budget. I understand they wanted to get the first one out of the road, low risk. You look at what's happening in the UK, I think politically, that would have been in the back of their minds. But I think, in May next year, there's some really tough conversations that are going to need to be had. For me to look at Australia and have 1 in 6 children now living in poverty, 1 in 6 children growing up in poverty, and the impact that's going to have on all of our futures, that's not the Australia that I think we all want. And that comes down to tough conversations about priorities. Currently, with fossil fuels making absolute bank from the war in Ukraine, we're still subsidising fossil fuels more than we're spending on public schools. Like, if you let that sink in, I think it shows you the level of madness when it comes to fossil fuel subsidies.
Big ideas on the table tonight: direct rebates for Jackie Lambie, big intervention, and intervention for David Pocock and Adam Bant. Thank you all for joining us. Obviously, many conversations more to follow. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching the first hour of the ABC's budget coverage tonight. Next up, David Speers will have more analysis, more excellent analysis. I'll be back with 7:30 tomorrow night. Until then, good night.
Welcome back. Treasurer Jim Chalmers has delivered his first budget, along with mostly grim news about the economic outlook and the state of the books. We're going to explore what the forecasts tonight mean for your wages, energy bills and job prospects. And we'll look at what the government's doing to help steer Australia through some pretty choppy waters internationally, with Laura Tingle, Andrew Probyn and Stan Grant. That's coming up shortly. First, here's a snapshot of what you need to know tonight. We're going to start with the outlook on the economy, which really frames this whole budget. The war in Ukraine, the prospects of a global recession have all dramatically changed the outlook from where we were in the pre-election budget back in March. First up, GDP, or growth. It is forecast to slow from 3.25% this financial year down to 1.5% next year. It picks up after that, but worth remembering, forecasts in these later years are always less reliable. Who knows what the world might look like then. But on these forecasts, Australia at least isn't dragged down into a recession, but Treasury is forecasting only sluggish growth next year, lower than the Reserve Bank is expecting. Inflation, this next line, is really influencing the whole budget, according to the Treasury. This is the big one. It's being pushed up, we know, by a range of factors, but it's electricity and gas prices we find out about tonight in the budget. Forecast to rise electricity prices more than 50% over the course of this year and next, about 56%. Gas prices are forecast to rise over this year and next by more than 40%. So it's a steep rise. And that's pushing up inflation. It's going to peak, it's expected, in the next couple of months of this year. But then it's going to remain pretty stubbornly high, 3.5%, then 2.5%, 2.5%. It means cost of living pressures and higher interest rates are going to be with us for a while yet. Then look at wage growth, and you can see wages just aren't rising as much as inflation, 3.75% this year. Next financial year, it does start to tick over. That's the crossing point, the tip-over point, where you start to get some real wage growth. Wages growing just higher than inflation, but only just. And then a bit better real wage growth over those out years. Finally, unemployment. It is rising from its current level of 3.5% up to 3.75% by the end of this financial year. 4.5%, 4.5% after that. What does that mean? Well, around 150,000 people set to lose their jobs based on these numbers. What does all of this mean for the budget bottom line? Well, a much improved deficit, as it turns out, for this year, just a tick under $37 billion. In fact, that's halved, thanks to the stronger commodity prices and a stronger jobs market. That's really where the good news ends. The deficits are then going to blow out again. They'll in fact be a little bit worse than previously forecast over those remaining years. And this really tells you the story, the gap between revenue and spending. Have a look at it there. Total government revenue, this is as a percentage of the economy, rises a bit before it then settles at around 25% of GDP. Spending, well, you can see it continues to grow and grow and grow. And in fact, if you went right out to the 10-year projections that are in the budget, it finally hits about 28% of GDP by the end of that decade. What does all of that mean for debt? Well, it's still growing. It won't quite hit the peak, the forecast hit by the coalition of over $1 trillion, but it will come close. It's still just over $1 trillion. Labor has found some savings in this budget, infrastructure projects that it's cancelled or delayed, but no structural savings that are going to actually fix this problem that's going to be there across the course of the forward estimates and the decade. In the meantime, the Treasurer has announced some new spending measures tonight. He argues they're all productive, they won't put upward pressure on inflation. There's increased subsidies for childcare promised at the election. They don't kick in until mid-next year. Paid parental leave will increase to 26 weeks, but only gradually. It won't cost the budget that much over the course of the 4-year forward estimate's only $530 million. There's Labor's promise to lower the price of prescription medicines, $756 million. A pretty modest plan to work with the states and the super funds to provide more affordable housing, but again, not until 2024. New infrastructure spending as well of $9.6 billion. Now, the Treasurer says he'd love to be in a position to spend more, but he doesn't want to do anything that's going to put even more pressure on inflation and interest rates and drag down real wages even further. It's this inflation challenge that really underpins everything. Casey Briggs takes a closer look at how it's impacting on the budget.
Our era of peculiar economic figures continues as the cost of goods spiral globally.
The highest inflation in 41 years.
Back in double figures. Touching a fresh record high.
Higher than expected Japanese inflation.
And if the early data we've seen is any guide, tomorrow's quarterly update from the ABS will show inflation in Australia at a high we haven't seen in more than 30 years. Let's zoom in on what's happening now though, and rewind to March when the boffins in Treasury thought inflation would have peaked by now at 4.25%. They now think it'll keep rising from here to 7.75% by December, and then start falling below 3% just in time for the next election. A big chunk of that inflation rise is from rises in the price of electricity, expected to jump 20% late this year and another 30% next financial year. The budget warns further rent rises are on the way too. And that's not great news for a government that came to office with this as a central refrain.
Everything is going up.
Going up. Going up. Going up.
Except people's wages.
So let's look at wages, because while annual inflation was above 6% at the end of June, wage growth was less than half that at 2.6%. There's some improvement in that anticipated, but the budget thinks wages growth will flatline and it'll start with a 3 for years, which means the government's relying on inflation coming down below that to deliver workers a real wage rise. And inflation can be erratic, especially when there are shocks like wars and natural disasters. As the budget notes, domestic disruptions, including the recent floods, will test our resilience further. It seems our resilience is getting tested more and more often. Since Black Summer, we then had flooding in 2021, and this year in February, in March, in July, and October. In a changing climate, are natural disasters and conflicts the anomaly, or something we should start regarding as normal?
Casey Briggs there. Let's go back to Jeremy Fernandez, who's testing some immediate reaction to the budget in Pakenham in Melbourne's southeast tonight. Jeremy.
David, one of the key announcements tonight was around family violence, some extra funding to address programs and issues around family violence. I've got Andrew Guy with me. Andrew works in the family violence sector. Andrew, what was your impression of that announcement?
I think it was a really good, welcome announcement. I think you look at addressing family violence as a matter of ensuring safety and well-being for women. I think it's unacceptable that we live in a peaceful country, but there are many women and girls out there who are living in fear in their own homes and on the street. So it's really something that needs a national approach, and it's really good to see some money in there tonight.
How do you have a sense of how far that money will go? $1.7 billion.
Yeah.
I'm sure you could use many multiples of that amount. How far will that money go?
To be honest, I'm not sure if you see how the Victorian government has really set a gold standard over the last few years. So something billion, may not go that far. But I think it's looking at a targeted approach around early intervention to address some of the behaviours that lead to people committing family violence. And also, I think also behavioural change program as well. So a bit of partnership between the federal and the state government in addressing this issue will be really good.
Now, just very quickly, cost of living is a big issue in this community. Do you think people will be pleased with what they heard very quickly?
Yeah, I think there were some concerning projections in the budget, especially the slowdown in wages. I think when you see the cost of living rising on almost everything, fuel, groceries, renting and, mortgages and all that. So I think there are a lot of people there that will be hard to take the news tonight, in some aspects.
Got it. Andrew, thank you very much. David, back to you.
Government's trying to do in this budget, how does it stack up given the economic outlook, and where are the political pressure points likely to be? I'm joined by Laura Tingle, Andrew Probyn and Stan Grant. Stan, let me come to you first, in fact, because I want to pick up on the points, rather powerful points you were making earlier in the coverage about the burden of fighting inflation really falling disproportionately on the poor. We see in tonight's budget what's going to happen or what's expected to happen with electricity and gas prices. Now, the government's argued it can't really do much because it's going to further fuel inflation. But this is happening around the world.
That's the problem.
What are others doing to deal with this problem?
Well, they're not dealing with it, David. That's the problem. We saw what happened in the UK with Liz Truss when she tried to reduce taxes on the rich, and it just sent the UK into a tailspin, and she lost her job. We've seen in the United States that this sort of inequality is baked in, and it is distorting the political system. It's causing more division in the society. One thing we know about a high inflationary cycle is that it's a tax on the poor. And the little dirty secret, of course, about all this is that if you put more money in the hands of the poor who spend it, it also then stokes more inflation. So this is the bind that we find ourselves in. Now, if you look at what we heard tonight, and the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, was upfront about this will land disproportionately on those who are heavily indebted and those who are poor. They're not going to see a wage rise maybe till 2024 or even after. There's going to see an increase in unemployment. The economy is going to shrink to 1.5%. Productivity is going to be low. Where does this feed back into the economy to even lift wages down the line? They're going to have to bear all of this while a wealth gap in Australia is continuing to grow. And here's the fundamental unfairness, David. We have people, and we can include ourselves in this, who've benefited from 30 years of economic growth. We've seen our house prices go up, the house values go up 2 or even 3 times. We've got a buffer, we've got savings. But the people that Jeremy was talking to tonight, living in caravans, wondering at what the future is going to look like, know that they are in for a couple of years of pain. And at what point and how, given the medium-term outlook, are we going to seriously be able to reckon with the type of tax reform that may be able to redistribute? So, and all of that set against the icy winds that are blowing through the global economy.
Well, they sure are. Just sticking on this energy price challenge, it can create a big political headache for the government as well over the next year or so, Laura. What are some of the options, seriously, that it's looking at, do you think?
Well, good question, David. They've got so many various items out there. I think that they're going to be really reluctant to do any sort of really huge interventions in the market. I mean, we know they've tried some. So the question is, Do they at some point say, OK, we've got to provide a bit more cost of living assistance? I think that they probably won't. They may well hope that prices start to fall. We've already seen a 71% fall in gas prices in Europe, which is pretty staggering in the last few months. So maybe they're just hoping that they can ride this out, and that it'll start to ease. There is obviously not agreement within the Cabinet about exactly what to do about this, and you can't affect both supply and price at the same time. It's just not that easy to do.
The slightly odd thing about covering this budget tonight, as I'm sure you'd all agree, is we're talking a lot about the things they still need to do, not about what they've done in this budget. But that is, we should remind people, because it's made it clear this budget is really the conversation starter for the tough decisions to come. One of the toughest is going to be the NDIS, Andrew. What does this budget actually tell us about where things are going with the NDIS, and how worried is the government about it?
Well, I think both Treasury and the government are really, really worried. A 14% growth of any spending in 1 year is enormous. Now, behind the scenes, we're told that Treasury expects that NDIS will go from about 1.25% of GDP to 2.5% within 10 years. That would be taking disability spending beyond that of defence. Now, clearly, that trajectory is unsustainable. What does it do? Well, it's going to have to tackle it in a multi-pronged way. We've got states and territories that have left this space. We have Bill Shorten last week was saying that we can't forget those with complex needs, that they had to be at the forefront here. So there's clearly going to be something there as well.
Laura, let me ask you the political question I think that's hanging over this. Has the government opened up too many conversations at once here without answers, whether it's on energy prices, the NDIS, or is it happy to have these conversations now run between now and May?
Well, they're all interconnected, I think. So I think it's, it is just what it is. The government has enough confidence in itself that it is prepared to let those discussions go. On the NDIS, yes, it's scary, but it is also something that is solvable. Part of the problem is, of course, that the NDIS was supposed to be part of a network. There was supposed to be an ecosystem out there of support for people who weren't that disabled. That's disappeared because the states and local governments have cleared the area. So it's going to require something more than just the federal government here, David. It's going to require several layers of government to reconfigure the entire system.
Stan, just very quickly, the other question I had for you, a lot of the forecasts here hinge on what happens globally, and a lot of that hinges on big geostrategic questions around Ukraine, around China. I mean, how much faith can we have in these numbers tonight?
Well, we saw what the impact of the Ukraine war was. It has sparked this inflationary cycle, which is also having a political impact around the world as well and making people poorer. We've seen the impact of that. We know that China is slowing. It's going to grow at around 4%. It's projected next year. Gee, we'd love to have 4%, but that's a long way down on where they were. They're still battling COVID. They have this COVID zero policy. They're still going into lockdown. They're dealing with the drought as well and an ageing population. The thing to watch out for, David, that I look at all of this is the black swan event. What's the thing that we don't see coming? We didn't see COVID coming. We should have seen Ukraine coming, but we didn't act on it. And what about Taiwan? What if Xi Jinping does move on that? What impact does that have? We've got to factor in or think about the black swan event.
OK, just quickly, David, on what could happen. We could have a situation where the war in Ukraine does extend for another year or two. If that is the case, we could have a remarkable situation where this budget actually goes into surplus this financial year, and yet we've got these structural deficits and massive complaints.
But energy prices would continue to be a problem for a whole lot longer. Anyway, we'll have to leave it there. Stan Grant, Andrew Probyn, Laura Tingle, thank you all very much. Let's take a closer look at what this budget means for business with ABC business reporter David Chow.
Things are going to be tough for the next year or two for those running a business. Australia's economy is set to grow at a much slower pace compared with how it's been doing since the global financial crisis. But Treasury reckons we'll avoid a recession, even if Europe and the world's major economies suffer a nasty downturn. And with high interest rates and cost of living pressures, households are expected to spend a lot less, which isn't great for business. So the government has announced a number of what it calls targeted measures to help business owners address skills shortages and transition to clean energy. The government is boosting the permanent migration intake from 160,000 to 195,000 people, hoping more high-skilled migrants will come here. So the government will spend an extra $42 million for the Home Affairs Department to process its visa backlog a bit quicker. And work restrictions for international students will be relaxed until the middle of next year. Meanwhile, the government will offer 480,000 extra spots at TAFE and vocational education centres focused on industries and regions with skills shortages. And they're trying to lure more pensioners back in the workforce. The amount they can earn before they're aged or veteran pensions get reduced will rise from $7,800 to almost $12,000. On top of that, the government is setting up a new energy apprenticeship scheme to entice more workers to join the clean energy industry. Basically, these apprentices will be able to claim financial support of up to $10,000 over a few years. And finally, for owners of small to medium-sized businesses, the government wants them to upgrade their old and inefficient equipment through energy efficiency grants, which will cost taxpayers $62 million. All up, the government is hoping that'll be enough to address worker shortages and advance its clean energy goals.
Well, the government argues this is a responsible budget, and economists might agree they have tonight, but for a lot of low and middle income households, the next couple of years are going to be tough. Wages are going to struggle to keep up with inflation. Electricity and gas prices will be soaring, and the increased spending on childcare, paid parental leave and so on doesn't kick in for some time yet. Let's bring in Cassandra Goldie from the Australian Council of Social Service and Triple J Hack political reporter Shalila Medora. Welcome to you both. Shalila, let me start with you, in fact, on young people in particular. What are the highlights or lowlights in tonight's budget for young folks?
Yeah, the thing I'd say to point out is the education, the massive funding for education skills training, $485 million for 20,000 extra university places in areas of skills shortage, things like nursing, IT, engineering, and also $1 billion for 480,000 free TAFE courses. Massive expenditure here that's going to be shared with the states and territories. But what I think is really interesting about all of the major education funding policies is that they're targeting underrepresented students. So First Nations students, students with disability, students from outer suburban areas or outside the major cities. And that is really redressing a massive issue, which is the imbalance when it comes to tertiary education. Lowlights, I would say there's nothing on mental health, very, very little on mental health. There's nothing on rental assistance, which we know is really, really hitting young people at the moment. Rental assistance, if you're in a share house, is $100 a fortnight. So that disappears very quickly. So I think those are the two things that I was really looking for that were lacking in the budget.
Cass, on the fact that electricity, gas prices rising, you know, inflation's still a big problem outstripping wages. I mean, the government's argument is if it were to put more money in people's pockets to help, it would drive inflation higher. What do you think?
Well, I think we've got a budget that delivers on some good, election commitments. Measures like PPL, paid parental leave, childcare, and investment in aged care, $3 billion provisioning for disaster recovery measures, and that big housing accord. But we're deeply concerned, David, about people on the lowest incomes. Right now, in this budget, we don't have what they needed, which was a lift to their incomes. I mean, job seeker and youth allowance, $48 a day, $38 a day for youth allowance. It is absolutely crushing for them. It feeds directly into these issues of mental health. Chronic financial distress leads to people becoming really unwell. And of course, the government wants to talk about wellbeing. So do we. We have to get a focus, the discipline that's required to target the measures where people really need the help the most, and we didn't have that in the budget.
I just wanted to ask you about this chapter in the budget titled Measuring What Matters. This is the first step towards a wellbeing budget, or having wellbeing measures measured in the budget alongside all the other economic stuff that's there already. Why do we need to measure things like healthcare and education and so on in a budget?
Well, because a budget is there for a community, for people. It's an economy is there for people and communities, not the other way around. And you ask anybody about why they go to work, they'll typically say, so I can feed my family. I live to work. That's the reality of it. And so it is important that we finally ask the right questions when we're setting budget policies. Now, if we had a wellbeing framework, David, we would not be doing stage 3 tax cuts. would we? We wouldn't be spending $254 billion delivering more to people who've already got more. You'd be targeting
So is this laying the groundwork for some of those changes, do you think?
We need to be tracking the level of poverty in Australia. We're a very wealthy country, but we still have over 3 million people, including 760,000 children, who are living in poverty. People are going without food, they're going without medicines. You talk to any young person who is on their own and they're trying to get an education, they are going without food right now to try and keep rental happening.
And raising the rate is actually something that is indicated as a barrier to education as well. So it's something that if you're studying and you don't have the amount of money that you need to continue to study, you're going to drop out. So it is something that is actually goes hand in hand with education.
And Shalala Cass mentioned the housing accord that's announced in tonight's budget. Does it amount to much?
Look, it's what we actually know from it is very little. We still need to find the detail. We don't know what the eligibility is for people in terms of who can apply for these kind of grants, who can get them, where they're based, where they're located.
It's meant to be so you can live near where you work.
Yeah, but who can apply for it? You know, what does affordable mean in this particular instance? Is there a barrier in terms of what you have in assets and what you earn, all of those kind of things? Those questions haven't really been answered. And what we know solidly is 10,000 from the federal government, with potentially more with private investment. And that seems to be the bulk of the announcement, is anticipating private investment to build these affordable houses, and it is still a target with very little substance at this point that we know of.
More work to be done on that as well. Shalala Cass, thanks both very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Well, let's check in for a final time tonight with Jeremy Fernandez at Pakenham in Melbourne's southeast. Jeremy.
David, one of the issues, again, that keeps cropping up here in Pakenham as we talk with our voters who've been watching this budget tonight is that issue of housing affordability. Orlando, you are a homeowner. Yes. There was a significant announcement in the budget tonight about housing affordability. What were your impressions of that?
Look, I think it's important. I think it's good that first home buyers are being taken into account. I mean, I've got younger family members that are looking to enter the market, and I think it's really important to take them into consideration. We bought our house 2 years ago, and the rise of price, it has gone up, you know, is just quite substantial. So if we didn't have anything to back us up from the government, I don't think we'd be able to get the same quality of house that we have at the moment. So it's important, I think.
Shez, what about for you in looking at the issues that were raised in the budget tonight? What stood out for you?
The fact that they're spending quite a bit of money on housing, I think that's a really big issue at the moment. Social housing. There are so many struggling people out there that are in a position that they can't put a roof over their head, which is a basic right, and they're working and they can't afford it, which is really harrowing, because it's a basic right, food and shelter, and it's never been this bad before. And single mothers and people that are on low incomes need a real hand up.
And you can see the confluence of those pressures span coming together: cost of living, natural disasters, rising fuel prices, and then you add housing on top of that. For you, what stood out for you from the budget?
Well, like you just said, it's a perfect storm. We're in for a hard time, whatever happens. I'm just hoping that we're in for a hard time or something constructive's being done. I would have been very disappointed if housing didn't get a mention. At the same time, I was a little disturbed to hear Jim Chalmers say that they didn't want the government to do so much, they wanted the market to. I'm wondering where this problem came from in the first place. I just remember the issue years ago with insulating houses, and a lot of shonky operators got in on it and took advantage of it and got a free ride off the government's ticket. I hope that we do better this time.
Andrew Guy, we know that multicultural communities feel the pinch in a very particular way, particularly in these outer suburbs of the cities like Pakenham. How are these housing issues impacting multicultural communities?
It's really impacting on a lot of families, and I think the other thing to take into account is that there's a lot of people that are working in very low-paying jobs, and I think that's why, hearing that government was wanting to do something about that, I think it's really something to look at. And I think when people are working in a low-paying job and there are a lot of pressures, on the family income, the cost of living that we've talked about, I think it's better hard for a lot of families.
But at the same time, those announcements don't do anything for you. You're saving for a house, and you will keep saving for a house because these measures don't really help people like you. How do you feel about that?
I still think that owning a house is still the great Australian dream. But it's getting harder for a lot of younger people out there, a lot of younger families. And I think it's something that, this is where the government incentives comes in. And what happened tonight hasn't gone far enough. I think that's good to acknowledge.
Samantha, I want to get to you about, you work in the caring sector. Some really positive signs, I think, for people who work in your sector.
Yeah. Obviously, we all knew it was going to be a difficult budget, tight, with everything that's happened internationally and here in Australia over the last little while. But I'm so pleased that they're supporting the vulnerable people. So I'm so pleased about the education that's coming for the aged care sector. I'm really pleased about, single mothers being supported to get back into the workforce if they choose to. I felt really hopeful with this budget, I must say.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming out and talking to us tonight. I know it's been quite the 2.5 years with going through all the issues, not to mention this perfect storm of pressures that are landing on households. David, it's back to you.
Jeremy, thank you very much. And just to pick up on that final point there raised about the caring sector, we're still waiting for a Fair Work Commission, an independent umpire decision on aged care workers' pay. It's not funded in this budget, but the government has promised that whatever that outcome is, it will do its bit to ensure that is delivered to aged care workers as well. The other thing you can really pick up hearing the people that Jeremy's talking to there in Pakenham throughout the night, yes, while the government will argue that it's doing the responsible thing, not fuelling inflation by pumping more money into people's pockets to help with all of these pressures, the politics are still going to be difficult for the government. There's no doubt about it. People are going to be hurting. They're going to be looking to the government for help. Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, will have his budget reply a little later in the week. We'll have coverage of that as well on Thursday evening. But that's it for now. For viewers on the ABC News channel, Kath Robinson continues our coverage with a budget night edition of The Business. From us here in Canberra, good night.
Welcome to the Business Budget Special. I'm Catherine Robinson. The Treasurer Jim Chalmers has brought down his first budget, offering businesses a handful of programs which experts say tinker around the edges rather than deliver bold reforms. A structural deficit heading towards 2% of GDP isn't budging, and experts say this budget could be laying the foundation for tax hikes down the track. Business says more should have been done to tackle soaring energy costs, which is a key driver of inflation. The Treasurer is warning of hard times ahead as Australia grapples with surging costs of living, higher interest rates, lower growth and the prospect of a global recession. Since March, the bottom line has improved thanks to a revenue boost from higher commodity prices and more people in work. But the deficit and debt is set to grow as spending on the National Disability Insurance Scheme and borrowing costs balloon. Economic growth will more than half next financial year, and Australians can expect their wages to go backwards for another 2 years. I spoke to the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher, after the Treasurer's speech. Minister, welcome to The Business.
Thanks for having me on.
The budget is facing a structural deficit of 2%. What is the government's strategy for getting rid of that debt? According to your chart, that doesn't budge from 2% of GDP until the end of those charts, which is 2032.
Yeah, so I think what you're seeing today in the budget is a very honest assessment of where our budget is. The fact it is, as you say, in structural deficit. We've inherited a budget in this position. Part of this budget is dealing with the first phase of budget repair and also, I think, being upfront about the state of the budget and really starting a conversation about how we manage these pressures against, a very challenging set of circumstances. And I think part of that is how do we pay for the things that Australians value the most?
So will that conversation, though, about the debt be about either raising taxes or cutting spending to deal with it?
Well, I think it's a broad conversation in a sense it has to be all of those things. You know, we know that some of the pressures, the structural pressures are things that Australians value. So, you know, healthcare, aged care, the NDIS, defence, they're 4 of the fastest growing programs. The fastest is servicing the interest on the $1 trillion of debt we've inherited. So you can see against those 5 programs, 1, we have to do in terms of managing the debt, and 4, we know Australians value and we've got to work out a way to pay for it.
We've been told to expect a focus on quality spending from the government, on spending which drives economic efficiencies. The government has approved a $2.2 billion suburban rail loop. That doesn't have the approval of Infrastructure Australia. You have said that it has a positive benefit-cost ratio. The Victorian PBO says it's negative. How can we be confident that the government will get it right when it comes to quality spending?
Well, we've got a huge focus on that. You're seeing the first results of the spending audit that I've led, $22 billion in savings or reprioritisation across government. Part of the discussion about how we manage the budget is budget repair and making sure that every dollar we're spending is actually delivering an economic dividend or working for families across Australia. So, you know, that is absolutely the sharp focus that we take on that. On that project that you raised, we are working with the Victorian government. They do have a business case that underpins it, and they are talking to Infrastructure Australia about it. So infrastructure, you'll see, you know, we're definite about business cases having some rigour that underpins these decisions, which is why we have made some changes to the infrastructure program where those business cases don't exist.
On to energy now, Minister. $41 million has been allocated to the ACCC for the oversight of gas markets and the implementation of reforms to the ADGSM, as well as energy efficient grants worth up to $62 million. Is the government taking energy seriously and the concerns of energy from business seriously? Are these measures enough to avoid an energy crisis in the near term?
Well, again, I think we're paying the price for a wasted decade. We've obviously had a war in Ukraine really since the election, and we've inherited this energy crisis that's sort of from a failed, 22 policies that never landed anywhere. So we're doing the work to clean up these arrangements. There's more to be done. We're acutely aware of the pressure that energy prices is having on households and businesses, and there's more work to do. Part of it is getting our Powering Australia plan up and running, and you'll see quite a lot of investment in that in the budget. But yes, this is one of the most significant challenges I think we face, and the government is working very hard on it, and we'll have more to say about it.
So that work to do, will it involve a windfall profits tax or changes to the PRRT?
Well, we haven't considered those. They're not in this budget. I think the Treasurer has made it clear that we are, and he's leading the work on this across government, across a group of ministers who are sharply focused on it, is looking at whether there does need to be some increased regulatory intervention. I mean, that is a live conversation, and I think, Australians expect us to be looking at all options to make sure that we are managing these very, very sharp increases. Part of this is feeding into our inflation problem and making inflation stick around a bit longer before coming back to more normal levels. So we absolutely understand this is a big challenge. It requires the attention of government, and it's going to get it.
Minister Gallagher, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has described surging energy bills as one of the biggest cost of living challenges facing the country. Treasury assumes retail electricity prices will climb by 20% by the end of 2022 and a further 30% next financial year, while gas prices will also surge. Industry groups say the federal budget ignores their calls to provide price relief for struggling businesses. Rihanna Whitson reports.
Capral is the nation's largest maker of aluminium goods. For decades, relatively cheap energy has meant manufacturers like this could stay competitive against overseas rivals.
That changing situation is putting Australian manufacturers at risk. We're looking at gas increases of fourfold to what we've currently been paying. And then we've got the electricity price increases on top of that.
The boss, Tony Dragicevic, didn't get what he wanted from the federal budget, which was a price cap on gas.
It just seems incredible that we're now exposing local manufacturing to international gas prices which have gone through the roof.
The ACCC's measure of gas prices shows the cost per gigajoule has gone from around $4.70 2 years ago to $67 now. Forecasts out to 2024 expect the price to stay above $30. This carpet manufacturer just signed a new gas contract, costing 4 times the old price.
And if we're not able to find ways to offset that, then we obviously do need to put our prices up.
The company employs 200 people in Victoria, where the spot price hit $800 a gigajoule before a temporary price cap was imposed. The managing director says it's a shame the budget didn't include a rebate for gas users.
Many employees at our business have been here for up to 47 years, would you believe? So a lot of long-term people, and we like to keep it that way. We like to keep everyone employed.
Instead, $44.8 million from scrapped manufacturing programs will go towards setting up a national reconstruction fund. $113 million will be spent on regional projects, and $65 million will help regulators monitor the gas industry, which has been accused of price fixing. Treasurer Jim Chalmers has hinted it will take regulatory intervention to rein in energy prices, which is all businesses can hope for, because there was basically nothing in the federal budget to address the immediate problem of soaring energy costs that are a key driver of inflation.
The government could impose effectively a tax on the windfall profits the companies are making. These companies are doing very well at the moment, and the government could use that either as a threat or a real tax to help pay for price reduction.
Power prices were hovering around $50 a megawatt hour in October 2020. Now they're around $200 and expected to climb even higher due to the Ukraine war. Electricity bills are this children's centre's biggest expense. But the owner says taking advantage of the new energy efficiency grants worth $62 million won't be easy at this rented site.
You don't want to be having no air conditioning and then you can't say, OK, today the jumping castle is not on because, we can't afford.
Instead, Christine Laws had to slash the business's operating hours.
We have to do it just so that we can survive and get over this. And hopefully there is no recession.
Following the yellow brick road, hoping to find an answer to the energy crisis.
Well, joining me in the studio for more analysis is independent economist Nikki Hutley and Judo Bank's Chief Economic Advisor Warren Hogan. Good evening to you both. Thank you very much for joining us. Nikki, I might just start with you. We heard from the Finance Minister earlier there at the top of the show. This budget seems to be more about setting up a big conversation rather than action right now. Is that the right approach?
Yeah, well, look, I think everybody would have liked more cost of living help right away and immediately, but they had the challenge of how do you do that without stimulating inflation and making the Reserve Bank's job harder. This takes a bird's eye look at the economy. It's doing the big issue things, dealing with, improving participation in the economy through a lot of the women's issues, paid parental leave. Well, I shouldn't say it's family issues, paid parental leave, obviously childcare, which is really important. Even some of the things like climate, really pulling back the energy transition. These are big, long-term issues. They're setting us up for big changes, not for immediate assistance.
Warren, do you think more could have been done, particularly when you look at the issue of the structural debt, which goes on beyond the horizon there? I mean, what do you think we're being set up for here?
Well, there's clearly the groundwork's been laid for this conversation about our structural budget position. I mean, there's no two ways about that. And it is stark. We're short about $50 billion a year at the federal level. Our spending over our taxes, and the magnitude of that, I think some people ask, well, why aren't we getting on with the job? Because it is still 7 months away. So that's one question that comes. But I think, as Nikki was saying, we are starting a conversation, and it's not just about that structural deficit. It's about how we actually deal with it, and that's where we raise taxes. Do we deal with certain programs such as the NDIS? And it's going to be a very, very important 6 months before that next budget.
Do you think this is the government managing expectations about tax hikes down the track?
The way I read the budget, reading not very far between the lines, is I think the government's setting us up for a higher level of taxation. The characterisation of the spending outlook around defence, around NDIS, around aged care, all these big items, is that this is what people want. And if we want to run a budget that is responsible and eventually is in balance, then we're going to have higher taxes. And this will be the biggest we'll have to take taxes to the highest level on record.
Which is politically very, very difficult, as we know. Nikki, fiscal policy, we know, played a huge role contributing to inflation over the last couple of years, particularly with the measures to support people throughout the pandemic. Do you think now, when you look at this budget, it's playing a part in bringing it down? I guess the question is there any part of this budget that's inflationary?
Look, I don't think so overall. If there'd been lots of cash splashes and handouts, then you'd be really worried. But this isn't giving people power. In fact, people in particularly low-income households are going to be doing it very, very tough. Anyone who's got a mortgage, anyone who basically goes to a supermarket is going to be doing it tough. We know that real wages are falling, and this has got really nothing that I can see that's going to, make the economy. There's no big spending items, no cash splashes that are going to stimulate the economy. By their own modelling, we're going to go down to 1.5% growth next year. That could actually turn out to be optimistic if the global environment falls apart a lot more quickly. So there's a lot more, to me, there's a lot more downside risk. I don't think they're making life difficult for, in terms of where interest rates go from here.
We've seen the catastrophe that can ensue, Warren, when monetary policy and fiscal policy work against each other. That's the UK experience. Do you think that this budget will keep those two working in step and working well in step to approach this inflationary environment that we're in?
Yeah, well, I agree with Nikki that they're not adding to the inflation problem. And look, that is something that they need to be commended on. There was a huge revenue windfall, which Australian governments for a decade now have been spending. So they resisted that urge. But fiscal policy has been part of this inflation problem all around the world, and they are doing nothing to help the Reserve Bank. So yes, they're not contributing to the problem, but there has been no fiscal tightening here. And given it's meant to be this tough budget at the start of a new government, the case could be made that they should have tightened up even further.
Well, as we've been discussing, the budget is promising cheaper childcare and expanded paid parental leave to boost female participation in the workforce. For more reaction from the top end of town, Rachel Papazzoni is live for us in Brisbane. Rachel.
Thanks, Kath. And I'm joined by Paul Scarra, who's the CEO of Pacific National, our biggest rail company in Australia, as well as Sarah Derry, the CEO of Accor Pacific, who are the company with the biggest, largest number of hotels in Australia. Sarah, I'll start with you. Hospitality is particularly a women-led industry, and your company has more women working for it than men. What do you make of the measures announced in the budget to increase parental leave, as well as making childcare more affordable?
Yeah. Look, these are really an important and significant measures that the government has announced today. At Accor, our workforce is 58% female, and we've got people in our workforce right across the gamut of sort of employees, frontline workers through to professionals. So what this does is, for Australian families, really delivers some terrific solutions. Childcare, the parental leave are important initiatives. What it means is that people can take that time, come back to work. It's not just good for families, but it's also good for business. And it really does mean that we can retain great talent.
Paul, of course, it's not just about helping women in the workforce. It's also about, I guess, encouraging men to take time off and increase the workforce overall. Skills is a massive shortage that we face in this country. Do you see it benefiting a sector like yours as well?
Absolutely, I do. I think it benefits the country as a whole. And I think with such a low unemployment rate, whatever is being done to encourage more available workers, we support. Fast-tracking immigration, making it easier for parents of both gender to come back to work, making it more flexible so there's a bit more balance in the family is very, very important. So we're very, very pleased to see that there's measures being taken to make more workers available in such a low unemployment environment.
Of course, part of the conversation around the workforce is wages, and we heard the Treasurer say that real wages will continue to go backwards, at least for another year. Businesses pay a lot of wages. Why aren't businesses increasing what they're paying their workforce, Sarah?
Yeah, what I would say is that we totally appreciate that there are cost of living pressures on Australian families and Australian workers. We pay competitively, but we've also got to remember it's more than just about wages. So what an industry like hospitality can do is really provide incredible careers for people. It's the training, it's the developments, the investment. And really what we can see in hospitality, it's a social elevator. So someone like myself, I actually started out working in food and beverage, had the opportunity with training and development and initiatives. And of course, being paid fairly is what it's about as well. But there are incredible opportunities available.
Paul, being in the logistics sector, we've seen how important that is to the function of our economy. Floods have impacted the ability to get food and produce to people up and down this side of the country, but also all the way across to WA. Was there much in the budget that you saw that would help benefit logistics? I mean, we did actually see a pulling back of some committed funds from the coalition.
Yeah, disappointingly, I think there's just not, and this has been the case for a few budgets now, there's just not enough being put into the supply chain, carbon-friendly transport like rail, and of course we've got a self-interest in making sure that happens. But we have an aspiration as a country to reduce our carbon emissions, and to do that you've really got to start thinking about the way you fund infrastructure. Where I come from, rail often gets bucketed in with passenger rail, which is seeing a fairly big investment in the country, and that is good for carbon emissions. But it doesn't really help the freight task in the country. We've got the third La Nina in a row, which is really unprecedented. We saw the line between the East Coast and the West Coast out for 3.5 weeks. We saw how vital rail is to keep the supermarket shelves stocked, and we saw people almost running out. There was no food and toilet paper in some supermarkets. So I think we have to focus on the future budgets, having more focus on resilience and capacity growth in carbon-friendly transport modes like rail.
Sarah, Paul mentioned energy and climate there. Soaring bills are affecting households, but they're also affecting businesses, and I imagine one that has a lot of hotels. Was there something in there that you think will provide some relief for the business sector in terms of those soaring bills?
I think there's some good strategies in there that will assist over the long term around sustainability and energy costs. I think what we've seen tonight with the budget, however, is really looking at the time. What's important right now? People are looking for opportunity, they're looking for security, they're looking for support, and that's businesses and Australian workers as well. So I think the initiatives we've seen, and particularly things around training, the university places, TAFE places, they're important initiatives as well. We've got to skill up Australia. We do have the biggest crisis we've got right now is around the skills shortage. It's a global crisis, and it's one that we face here, and we absolutely have to be competitive on that. So I think what we've seen is the right strategies for the moment we're in.
I guess a brief final thought from both of you. Any misses, any hits that you thought were important?
I think it was a responsible and safe budget. There weren't many surprises because they pebble dropped most of it in the lead up to it, and I think it's probably what we could expect from an incoming government that's going into budget repair. As I mentioned before, I'd love to see us really flip the way that rail and carbon-friendly infrastructure is priced and invested in the coming budgets.
Sarah, briefly from you.
Yeah, just very two key things for me. One is there's been some really good investment in tourism and marketing in Australia. This is a wonderful place to visit. We need continued investment in that. And the second thing is we need to see skilled workers returning to Australia. And so any investment and support and encouraging people to come here. So I'd like to see a little more in that space to make sure that we can actually fill that skills shortage and deliver to our customers.
Sarah Derry and Paul Scurrah, great to have you both on the program. Thank you. And Kath, it's back to you in the studio.
So much, Rachel. Warren, listening to that discussion there with Paul Scurrah and Sarah Derry, labour shortages is one of the key issues facing business at the moment. Do you think the budget has addressed this sufficiently?
Well, look, they're doing what they can within the constraints of not wanting to spend too much money. They're looking to fast-track the immigration process, and I think they were talking about that being successful, that is happening. There's the training, the TAFE places, the university places. You know, we've got to see that actually realised. Those places used. So it's
and we know it takes a long time to get through TAFE or to get through to university.
And you got to get businesses to want to send their staff to these things. So they got to follow through with marketing, for lack of a better word. So look, they're taking it seriously, and it's the single biggest issue facing business in Australia, along with emerging wage costs and other costs. So I think it shows that the government's taking that seriously. But more generally, I think the most that business could ask for from this budget is getting the economy onto an even keel, to take the pressure off interest rates, to take the pressure off labour markets, and to get the budget back into order. And this budget has taken a first step, but this is really Act 1 of a two-act play, and the second act has got to wait till May next year, which actually is not that far away. It's only 7 months.
Nikki, do you think those macroeconomic settings are right to support business? And while we're talking about business, we did hear from those guests there talking about the energy transition. And earlier in the program, we heard about those smaller businesses that didn't perhaps get what they wanted on energy. Where they missed out there, is there anything around the energy transition that could help business down the track?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as the macro settings, you know, the forecast they've got is for a slowing economy, but really they've got things picking up, you know, inflation peaks relatively quickly, real wages pick up within a couple of years. It's kind of a bit of a Goldilocks scenario, and it doesn't allow for, you know, there's a lot more risk in this, that things could in fact go pear-shaped. But in terms of what they're doing to support it, you know, we've needed for a long time far-sighted policies, and you know that's what tonight's budget has delivered. You know, so it's a bit rough to criticise it because it is far-sighted. Things like paid parental leave, you know, these sort of big, momentous policies are very, very important. And part of that, of course, is the climate transition. It's the first time. It's so wonderful to see a budget that has pages and pages about articulating the risks of climate inaction from a fiscal perspective and from an economy-wide perspective. It's got some small things in there like the energy efficiency grants for businesses, but the bigger thing again is a big picture story. It's about the investment in EVs and charging infrastructure, other sorts of electric vehicles, fleet vehicles for the government, obviously renewable energy zones and tying those into industry. There's a million different, there's a whole cornucopia of policies around climate here. It's, again, a first step. I think everything with this, it's a first step. And, you know, it is their first budget. You can't solve everything in one budget. Yeah, so it's
an idea to delay till May, which it might be a little bit tougher then. You know. But let's hear from other businesses now, because in the budget there were announcements around boosting skills with investment in TAFE places next year, plus extra cash to speed up processing visas to get more migrants into the country, as we've been discussing. Well, let's get more on this and go now to Sydney, where Alicia Barry is with the founder of drone maker Carbonix, Dario Valenza. Alicia, what's been the reaction?
Well, Kath, as you heard, there hasn't been too much in the budget for small businesses, but at this advanced manufacturer that makes remotely piloted aircraft, they have welcomed the government's attempts to reduce the cost of living, which will benefit its 26 workers. With me is the Chief Technology Officer and founder of Carbonix, Dario Valenza. Dario, firstly, let's start with the money being thrown at fast-tracking migrants into the country. How will that benefit your business?
It'll give us an access to a wider pool of talent. It's really the ability to bring in skills that might be rare and unique, bring them into the business where they can help us achieve what we want to achieve, and also transfer those skills to our existing workforce and help us move forward at scale more quickly.
And when we dig into the budget, there is the National Reconstruction Fund, which has $1 billion in it for advanced manufacturing. Do you think you can access some of that?
I think either directly or indirectly. I mean, what we do is advanced manufacturing, as in it's a high value-add activity. It relies on skills and very specific R&D, and we aim to provide a surveying tool that makes linear infrastructure inspections more efficient, gives our customers the ability to have very specific and timely information to make the decisions to make their operations more efficient. And the advanced manufacturing is an integral part of that. So being able to develop our tools further, develop the automation, the capability, and eventually lower the cost and scale is really key. So advanced manufacturing is really a sweet spot for us.
And you mentioned cost there, and of course the inflationary environment isn't just hurting households, but there's pain for businesses like yourself as well.
It affects all aspects of doing business. So the costs are higher because the cost of living for our team, the rent, the energy, logistics, which have been particularly sort of backed up recently. So anything that can be done to alleviate that pressure means that the cost of doing business is lower and the efficiency goes up, and it just allows us to do more with the capital that we have.
And a quick takeaway from the budget, when you and I were watching it, you noticed that efficiency seemed to be a bit of a theme, briefly.
Yeah, efficiency, one way to think about it is just doing more with less. So in our case, replacing a crewed aircraft with an uncrewed aircraft We have a smaller, leaner, more efficient tool, with a much smaller carbon footprint, that's able to fly lower, slower, more often, get really, again, valuable data. So for the same money, you can have a better view of what you're doing and you can make better decisions. So that's efficiency.
Dario Valenza, thank you so much for having us here. And back to you, Kat.
Thanks very much, Alicia. Just before we go, Warren, what do you think the missed opportunities were in this budget?
Well, I think they should be getting, well, they could have got on with it. They could have started to look at some spending, cutting some of the spending side of the budget and potentially started to try and look at some increasing of taxes. We've got a big budget challenge ahead of us, and the criticism that's going to come forward is that they haven't really done anything to address it.
And what could the ramifications be of delaying till May, not reining in spending now?
Well, I mean, look, if it's a spending issue, then of course, the biggest uncertainty that clouds all of this is the economy and just how much inflation we've got to deal with. If we've got a story that plays out like America, then we've got a lot more interest rate hikes to come, and we've got a much different budget situation and probably a worse one. So I think the fact that they're not getting on with it is going to draw some criticism, that they've really just sort of said this is the problem and not done anything about it. And then the other one that you could argue is that the tightening up of the budget a bit more to take some pressure off the economy and make the RBA's life even easier.
Nikki, what do you think we'll see in May now, given we've set the stage, the conversation is now starting? What is there realistically enough time to organise by May?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and maybe they should have framed tonight as a mini budget rather than as a full-on budget, because they were sort of just resetting the parameters given changes that have happened since the last one in March this year. So maybe expectations were a bit too high. That said, I'd probably disagree, Warren. I think they actually have done a lot. It's just that they've done a lot in delivering promises rather than, the budget repair task. They've only got so far through the line-by-line audit of what they can get rid of. But ultimately, until we've had this big conversation about what we're prepared to give up in terms of services or what extra taxes we're prepared to collect, it's very hard for them to do anything meaningful. So maybe they need to have another, talk fest, a summit a tax summit or some sort of budget fiscal summit in March, early in the new year, if they want to get more consensus happening. It's hard to see without an electoral mandate them doing really significant things, even though they've laid the groundwork to say we need all of this change. That's not a short-term conversation or an easy conversation. So I think it's going to be tough for them to make big decisions. But certainly one of the things they should be doing is absolutely tweaking the stage 3 tax cuts, because we can't afford those.
Yeah, and the time will tell on that one, whether there's a modification or not. We are out of time. Nikki, Warren, it's always great to have your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kath.
Thanks, Kath.
And that's all on the Budget Special from The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Thanks for your company. See you next time.